Welcome to Ghostly Tales channel. Are you looking for creepy, mysterious, and dramatic stories? You have come to the right place. Here, we will bring you unforgettable experiences with ghost stories, terrifying urban legends and mysteries that you have never dared to explore. Come with us into the world of mysteries, where every sound can make your heart beat faster. Please listen, everyone. Incense factory crime. Over the past few years, Mr. Fong's business has been getting worse and worse, because he doesn't have enough money to pay his workers, forcing some of them to quit. Mr. Fong sells all kinds of incense, such as agarwood and cinnamon, so earning 2 to 3 million dong for a month's work is considered the best in Tan Tu village. The factory originally had a fairly large dough mixer, which could mix up to several hundred kilos a day and produce quite a lot of incense. But because it had been used for so long, it had broken down and could no longer be used. When he bought a new machine, business suddenly went downhill. Although the machine was not exactly new, because he bought it from an acquaintance, it was said that this person's wife was unfortunately crushed to death by the machine falling down, and the machine had just been bought, and had only been used for a few months, not much. Seeing that Mr. Fong also needed to buy a new machine, he had to sell it to his workshop. At first, customers came in droves, but then only 2 or 3 traders came to buy, and gradually no one came anymore. It was said that the incense he made was very bad. It broke halfway through the burn, or wouldn't burn anymore. Sometimes the powder fell off completely, leaving only a bamboo stick. Many buyers complained a lot, and Mr. Fong also changed the way he mixed it and the way his employees worked, but nothing changed. Just last year, Mr. Fong borrowed 80 million from Mizon to maintain, intending to pay the rest when he had enough. Otherwise, he would pay Mizon 4 to 5 million each month, including interest. But after 2 or 3 months, Mr. Fong now has nothing left in his hands. He only hopes to earn money by selling incense to traders. Now no one dares to buy from him anymore. His reputation has dropped dramatically. Even the neighbors who often come to visit him no longer come. Looking at the newly bought machine, Mr. Fong planned to sell it to someone else, get rid of everything and retire, so he would have time to take care of his old wife. I pity my new wife, try to use her old body to maintain the workshop, help my son with money as much as possible. Consider it as giving him some time to save a little. Later, when he has a wife and children, it will be much less difficult. But now there is still a lot of debt. Mrs. On's debt is 60 or 70 million that has not been paid, so she has to take the burden for him. Thinking about it makes me feel sorry for her. Where is Mr. Fong? Why haven't you paid me back the money for the past few months? Just as she finished speaking, Mrs. On's voice echoed from outside the door. She walked into the workshop with her hands on her hips, glancing around. Mr. Fong sat checking the machines. Listening to her sour voice, he felt a headache. Who usually worships this woman? Why is she so powerful? Just a little reminder, and she comes. But anyway, Mrs. On helped him when he was in trouble. There was no way he could run away. Miss On, isn't it still 10 days until we get there? Why are you in such a hurry to come and ask for me in the middle of the night? Mr. Fong stepped out of his desk, looked at the plump woman in front of him, and asked curiously, "What month and year are your 10 days? You have been promising for months now, but have not seen any money." Mrs. On was furious. In the past, she respected Mr. Fong's big business and had a lot of connections. She had to lend him a few tens of millions to get by. She thought that, as usual, she would pay it all back in 2 or 3 months. Who would have thought that it would drag on for half a year, and there would still be more than 60 million left? The money was her hard-earned money. Wasn't it heartbreaking? I told you the other day, wait until Tai sends money at the end of the month, and I will give it to you. Why are you in such a hurry? Mr. Fong's face was also wrinkled, not because he wanted to default on his debt. It was all because this year's business was bad, causing the incense factory to stand still. No one came to buy incense from him. He also urged his son very much. He said he would come back at the end of this month and give him 20 million to pay Mrs. On, but after a few days she came back to ask for it. How could anyone hold back this anger? Tai, you keep asking me to wait for you all day long. Don't you feel embarrassed when you borrow it and let your son carry it? Mrs. On angrily cursed Mr. Fong, even laughing at him, making his face red to the ears. She could only keep quiet and not dare to say anything. Mrs. On saw that and immediately took advantage of the situation. I respect that you are a neighbor and don't charge interest. You borrowed 80 million and paid back 20, right? Pay me back the remaining 60, or I'll make a scene. But you can pay whatever you have in your hand, then I will give you 10 more days. 10 days later, when your son comes back, I will come and take it all. There will be no more concessions. I am too tired. You're going too far, you know that? Mr. Fong angrily spoke loudly, startling Mrs. On, but making her even more aggressive. Humph! Is it too much? Is it too much for me to take my money? In 10 days, you need to gather up the 60 million, or I will call the mafia to seize your house. Out of options, Mr. Fong could only give in and say, I will pay you 20 million in 10 days. I will try to earn the remaining 40 million to pay you. Never mind. I said 1 is 1, 2 is 2. My family needs it urgently now. In 10 days take care of it and gather enough. Mrs. On firmly disagreed, making Mr. Fong even more embarrassed. Looking at her face, he naturally felt dislike, but what could he do? Who told him to still owe her 60 million? But where can I borrow another 40 million? None of my relatives are rich. I have already borrowed from the bank. I still owe a few million. I can't borrow more. Mrs. On kept on speaking in a sharp voice, just like the women in the market. The more he listened, the more he couldn't stand it. In anger, he quickly grabbed the 36-inch wrench lying next to her, intending to hit her, but luckily his arm stopped in midair. His face red, and he was gasping for breath. Mrs. On panicked and raised her hand to cover her face. Seeing that Mr. Fong did not dare to hit her, thinking that Mr. Fong did not dare to attack, she raised her voice in a challenging manner, raised her chin and looked at him with an extremely unpleasant expression. What? You want to hit me? Hit me, a man who only knows how to bully women, and is good for nothing else. I'm telling you, if you touch a single hair on me, your whole family will not be able to live in peace. Seeing that she was not afraid at all, and even threatened his whole family, made Mr. Fong even angrier. He also had his own limits. If she kept going forward like that, one day he would be angered to death by her. In the midst of his anger, Mr. Fong suddenly heard a voice ringing in his ears, constantly urging and deeply penetrating his mind. Beat her to death. Beat her, and you won't have to worry about paying the debt. Beat her to death. The sound kept ringing like that continuously, along with Mrs. On's curses, causing Mr. Fong to almost lose his mind. In his anger, he struck a blow, the 36-inch wrench hitting her temple, causing her to fall left and right, her head spinning. Mrs. On screamed in pain, holding her head with both hands, clearly seeing blood gradually flowing down and wetting her face. Mrs. On was extremely frightened, not daring to believe looking at Mr. Fong in front of her, then used all her strength to run out the door screaming loudly. You dare hit me? Hey, Mr. Fong killed someone. Help! At this moment, the same ghostly sound continued to ring in Mr. Fong's ears, constantly reminding him, making his face even colder. Kill her quickly. Kill her. She won't scream anymore. Kill her. Kill her to shut her up. Strangely, no matter how loud Mrs. On shouted, no one could hear her, as if the surrounding sound was blocked. Mr. Fong aggressively chased after her with a wrench. Mrs. On was scared and wanted to run away, but suddenly she felt her legs stiffen as if something was holding her back. Bending down to look, she discovered 2 bloody hands holding her legs tightly. She was scared and sat down on the ground, her face pale. Seeing Mr. Fong rushing towards her like a wild animal, his eyes glowing red, Mrs. On frantically begged and pleaded, her voice stuttering. Forgive me. I promise I won't come ask you for anything again. Please forgive me. Mr. Fong had already lost his mind and could no longer hear anything. He only saw him swing the wrench and hit her straight on the top of the head. Mrs. On reflexively raised her hand to block. A loud crack was heard. Her arm was broken in half by him, the skin cracked, revealing each bone and layer of flesh. The sharp scream pierced the heart, making anyone who heard it shiver. Mr. Fong continued to strike, causing Mrs. On's arm to be crushed, not even having the strength to lift it up. With no arms to block it, the flag covered in blood fell heavily on top of her head, making loud cracking sounds as blood splattered everywhere. Mrs. On struggled in vain, until her body had no strength left, and she fell to the tiled floor, blood splattered all over the floor. Mr. Fong still did not stop, ruthlessly striking down with each chop, smashing her head into a pulp, a mushy mess of blood, flesh, and hair. After killing Mrs. On, Mr. Fong suddenly woke up. Looking at the horrible scene he had created with his own hands, he panicked and threw the wrench aside, falling to the ground, his face as white as a sheet of paper. Damn! Oh no! What should I do? Mr. Fong whispered, his voice trembling with each rapid breath. The cold feeling of the floor under his bare feet made him even more frightened. If the news of him killing Mrs. On spread out, it would be difficult to avoid the suspicious eyes and investigation of the police. He was worried about the serious consequences, maybe a life sentence or worse. In his mind, the image of his wife and children living in anxiety and insecurity constantly appeared. He could not imagine what their lives would be like if he were arrested by the police, and everything they had built over the years could collapse in an instant. Hurry up and get rid of the body. Get rid of it in a blender. For some reason, that evil thought suddenly appeared in his mind. In a panic, he decided to collect Mrs. On's body and hide it behind the house. Behind the house, besides the broken flour mixer, there was still another small grinder. In that pitch-black night, Mr. Fong alone cut Mrs. On's body into many pieces, then chopped it up and put it into the machine, grinding it into a red, slimy mess. Using the minced meat, he put it into the mixer that he bought from his close friend, mixed it with some wood powder. He was extremely nervous as he processed her body into a strange incense. He couldn't make all the powder he mixed in one night, so he could only make a small portion. He put the rest in a sack and hid it in the attic of the warehouse. Worried that the incense made from human corpses would give off an unpleasant smell, he took a few sticks, dried them in a dryer, and lit them to try. Strangely enough, there was no unpleasant smell or blood smell coming from it. Instead, it made it strangely fragrant. Even he felt refreshed just by smelling it, coupled with the gentle scent of agarwood. It made him even more fascinated by this fragrance. Before dawn, he had finished quite a bit of work, and the blood stains in front of the workshop had been cleaned up. Fearing that the police would come down to investigate and discover them, he cleaned all the machinery, including inside the house. 3 days later, Mr. Fong continued to use incense mixed with Ms. On's body, just wanting to quickly destroy all the evidence. He made a lot of incense because there was no one to make it, so he made it himself, dried it, and stored it upstairs. Every day, he lit 10 to a dozen incense sticks at the same time. Although the neighbors felt confused, they didn't care too much. The people around him initially found it strange, but gradually they got used to the scent he made. Ever since he lit those incense sticks, flies and mosquitoes didn't dare to fly to their house, and the children cried much less. So the more he lit, the better. During these days, Mr. Chien's family kept running in and out, constantly feeling anxious. Rumor has it that Mr. Chien's wife, Mrs. On, left on Monday and hasn't returned yet. Before leaving, she told Mr. Chien that she was going to Mr. Fong's house to collect a debt, and then to Lim's house. From that day on, her children and grandchildren never saw her again. They thought she had money and went somewhere to play, and a few days later she came back as usual. But when they called, the number was off. Afraid that something bad had happened, Mr. Chien and his children went everywhere to look for her, asking if she had stopped by anywhere. Coincidentally, Lim also disappeared somewhere the day before, and this guy owed his family 20 or 30 million. Mr. Chien was worried that he would harm her, so he went to his house to look for him, but couldn't find him. Having no other choice, he had to go to Mr. Fong's house to ask. When Mr. Chien arrived, he still saw Mr. Fong sitting there working hard. He found it strange that in broad daylight, old Fong was lighting incense. The scent wafted into his nose, causing Mr. Chien to cough. But the scent was really fragrant. Even though he was sensitive to the smell of incense, he had to take a few breaths to wake up. Seeing Mr. Chien coming, Mr. Fong suddenly panicked a bit, hurriedly hid the powder beside him behind his back, worried that he would discover something. Trying to keep himself calm, he forced a smile and greeted him. "Hey, what are you doing at my house so early in the morning?" "Mr. Fong, did my wife come by the other day? I'm so worried because she hasn't come home for the past few days." Mr. Chien's face showed obvious worry. He quickly asked. "Yes. She came to my house 2 days ago. I still had 20 million in my hand, so I gave it back to her first, saying I had 40 million left to give next month. Then she went straight home. I thought she had gone home," Mr. Fong said in a nonchalant tone, trying to act like he didn't know anything, but his chest was pounding with anxiety. Even Mr. Chien could not see the truth, so he sighed and said, "She must have gone to Lim's house, but I went to his house and didn't see him anywhere. He must have gone somewhere. When he comes back, come over and ask him," Mr. Fong quickly advised. "Yeah, I'm going home then." Mr. Chien was about to leave, but seeing the incense sticks lying next to the mixer, he suddenly stopped, pointed at the incense sticks, and asked curiously, "I saw you burning incense just now and it smelled so good. I wonder what kind of incense it is. Can you sell me some to burn at home?" Hey, that's not good," This is the incense I just made. It hasn't dried yet. Wait 2 or 3 days and I'll make it and give it to you." Hearing that, the old man was flustered and ran to put it in a cardboard box. Mr. Chien was surprised and went around to look at the desk. Mr. Fong wanted to stop him but saw him take 1 or 2 bundles in his hand and say, "It's okay, I can dry it later. It's so sunny today that I can light it up in just 1 day." He had no choice but to pray that Mr. Chien would not discover anything unusual, otherwise he would hardly be able to live in peace this time. "How much are these 2 bundles?" Mr. Chien examined the strange bundle of incense in his hand, then asked. "Haha, I'm giving these 2 bundles to you for free." Mr. Fong laughed awkwardly, his heart filled with anxiety. But what could he do? The incense was already in Mr. Chien's hands. If he took them back, wouldn't it just make him more suspicious? "Thank you. I'll go home first. Let's have a drink together some other time," Mr. Chien said happily. Mr. Fong outwardly agreed, but in his heart he prayed for the old man to leave as soon as possible, at least to burn all the incense sticks. Otherwise it would be easier to expose him if left too long. But Mr. Chien did not know that the incense sticks he had just brought back contained his wife's flesh and blood inside. He also burned her body and smelled it every night. For a long time, Mr. Chien's family still could not find Mrs. On's body. As for Lim, he jumped off the cliff and died after Mrs. On went missing. The police also confirmed that he did it. As for Mrs. On's body, no one has found it yet. Because the last culprit committed suicide, all traces were lost in the darkness forever. Mr. Chien's family also knew that Mrs. On had passed away, so they had to hold a small funeral, burying a mannequin in the coffin to replace her body. No one suspected Mr. Fong was the one who committed this heinous crime. During the peaceful time, after hearing the news from the neighbors, Mr. Fong finally breathed a sigh of relief, feeling more comfortable than ever. Finally, he no longer had to worry about the murder of Mrs. On being exposed. All the crimes were taken on his behalf by Lim. Since then, his workshop's business has been increasingly prosperous, with employees coming in droves to apply for jobs. Traders heard that his workshop sold good incense with long-lasting fragrance, so everyone came to sign long-term contracts with him. Tien's parents heard that the neighboring village was selling incense, so they went to a nearby grocery store and bought a couple of bundles, each bundle costing hundreds of thousands of dong per kilo, but they only left them on the table when they got home and never opened them or lit them. They planned to wait until they used up the old bundle of incense before switching to a new one. At this time, Tien also returned home from the north. When he left, he brought the ancient bell with him, going there to look for information about this object. Based on Tuan's dream last month, he also listened to his words and went all the way to Lang's Sun to find a teacher named Swang. Thanks to Master Swang, he knew the origin of the bell in his hand. This bell was from the Nguyen dynasty and was left by an ancient sorcerer. The bell contained extremely powerful magic power, the combined power of hundreds of sorcerers. Right now, he could not use all the energy inside, he could only use a small part. However, it was sealed by something, and if he wanted to open the seal, he needed a conductor. As for what the conductor was, Master Swang did not tell him clearly. At the same time, I have important news for you. Besides you, there is another person who also has the 8th soul. This news was truly earth-shattering. If it weren't for this trip to find the origin of the ancient bell, he probably wouldn't have known about this. Returning home after a long day on the bus, as soon as he arrived, he felt a strong smell of blood, which surprised him a bit. He couldn't feel where it came from, but he felt that there was something strange about the whole neighborhood. He was a bit suspicious, although it was already late afternoon. The sun had not yet set to the foot of the mountain, but the village was gradually covered in a red mist. In my heart, I knew something was going on in the village. As soon as he entered the house, he suddenly felt an unprecedented suffocating and heavy atmosphere, something he had never felt before in his own home. "Where are Mom and Dad?" Looking around the house. Not seeing his parents, he asked his little sister Deng. Seeing Tien return, Deng looked happy and said, "Brother is back already? Mom and Dad went out to the fields to cut rice. They must be back soon." "Yeah, but did anything happen when I left home? Why do I feel so strange?" Tien asked curiously. "What's so strange about that?" "Nothing happened," Deng asked, looking confused. "Not real?" he demanded. Deng still shook her head. Tien didn't dare ask too much, just secretly guessed that something must have happened at home, so he waited for his parents to come home and then asked to be sure. It was not until 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening that his parents returned. Deng's dinner was ready, and the whole family sat around the cozy dinner table. Mr. Lon and Mrs. Fuang kept asking him if there had been any unexpected events that month. Tian just told them vaguely, so they wouldn't have to worry. The whole family chatted until 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening, and he completely forgot what he should ask. It was not until the clock struck nearly 9 o'clock that Mrs. Fuang spoke up to ask for help. Tian, go upstairs and light some incense sticks. Oh, there are still 2 or 3 sticks of old incense left. Tear open the new package, and take that one to light. Tian heard that and quickly stood up, walked straight upstairs, carrying a lighter in his hand, intending to use it to light the incense sticks and light them around. In the small wooden censer, Mrs. Fuang had stuffed 2 huge packages of incense sticks. One package was almost burned, leaving only 2 bare sticks. These 2 sticks were of course not enough to light 4 or 5 places, forcing him to take a few more from the new package. When he tore open the incense wrapping, a strong smell of blood suddenly rushed into his nose, making him startled and quickly let go of the wrapping. His whole body was stunned as he looked at the 2 bundles of incense placed in the censer. Each of those coal-black incense sticks gave him an inexplicable, creepy feeling. He could also clearly see countless bloodlines swirling around, accompanied by strong resentment. This scene made Tian deeply afraid. Mom and Dad, come up here, I have something to ask you. He solemnly called out to Mr. Lon and his wife. What are you screaming for? Mrs. Fuang called out, running upstairs, her face filled with doubt. Mr. Lon also looked at him curiously. Tian pointed to the 2 bundles of incense and asked in a pressing voice, Where did you buy these incense sticks? I bought it at Mrs. Mai's shop. She imported it from Mr. Fong's warehouse in Tan-Tu village. I heard that fragrant incense is very effective in repelling flies and mosquitoes, but this incense is very expensive. I've been reluctant to use it lately, so I've waited until the old incense runs out before using it. Have you tried lighting it? Does it smell good? Mrs. Fuang saw that Tian only asked about the 2 bundles of incense on the table, thinking that he had already burned them, so she bragged and answered. Tian heard that. His face became more and more serious. You haven't burned them yet, have you? Not yet. This bundle is too expensive, it would be a waste to burn it, so I asked you to try burning it. His mother replied. What's wrong, Tian? His father was not as optimistic as Mrs. Fuang. He looked at Tian's expression and naturally knew it was not a simple matter, so he asked again doubtfully. It's good that you didn't burn it, otherwise it would be a shame. Tian said with a sigh of relief. Mr. Lon was startled when he heard that. Only Mrs. Fuang reacted a little slowly. Mr. Lon quickly asked, What do you mean? What do you mean by saying someone's sin is a sin? Do you know what this incense stick is made of? Tian's eyes became sharp. Mr. Lon and his wife were confused and didn't understand what was happening, still shaking their heads. Tian had to say what he saw. This incense stick is made from human corpses. If you burn it, you will be punished by death. Both grandparents were terrified, their faces pale. They knew Tian had the ability to see things that normal people could not see. But wouldn't it be too sudden to say it out loud? Mrs. Fuang half believed, half doubted, and quickly blamed. Speak correctly, son. If you speak carelessly in this place where people do business, you will die. Why don't you believe in aliens? I told you there's something wrong with this incense. I can see it clearly. Tian did not know how to make the 2 understand. He could only try to convince them. Luckily, Mr. Lon still chose to believe, turned to Mrs. Fuang and said, First of all, don't burn this kind of incense anymore. Give him 2 bundles of incense. Hearing him say that makes me feel a bit scared. What if I burn the wrong body? It'll be terrible. Although Mrs. Fuang said that, she still believed her son somewhat. After listening to Mr. Lon, she mumbled and let Tian handle it himself. Seeing that, Tian asked, Do you know if anything strange has happened in Tan-Tu village lately? Mrs. Fuang was silent for a moment. Thinking back to the incident at Mr. Qian's house 2 or 3 months ago, she began to recount everything from beginning to end, all of which were told by his mother when she went to the market. Tian listened and connected the whole incident, but the deeper he connected the 3 people. That was Mr. Fong, Mrs. An, and that guy named Lim. Tian, like Mr. Qian and some others, had no way of believing that. Mr. Fong had done something to Mrs. An. So whose flesh is in that incense stick? Let me see if that incense can summon souls. If it can, then ask. Tian whispered, then moved all the tools out to the yard, and began the soul-calling ritual. 2 bundles of incense were wrapped with charms, and slowly placed on the table. He kept reciting the incantations. After 15 minutes, Tien was surprised to realize that it was impossible to call the dead person's soul back. It's very possible that someone has sealed their souls, or is intentionally raising evil spirits. Tien's face turned pale and blue. This was the first time he encountered a situation where he couldn't summon a spirit. Even though he failed the first time, he wasn't disappointed and quickly regained his composure. Even a weak soul, I can call back. Tien had removed all the items on the altar table. Leaving an empty table, he then started looking around for some potted plants, gathered a handful of pebbles the size of a pinky finger, placed them on the table and arranged them into a circle, and arranged them into strange lines. He continued to place 2 bundles of incense on top, covering them with a few yellow talisman leaves. Once this step was completed, he placed a brush pen and a piece of white paper beside it. He held the ancient bell tightly, chanting mantras while shaking the bell in his hand. The parents sat inside the house looking outside. They anxiously waited to see what would happen, whether it was really as Tien predicted or not. At this moment, the wind outside began to blow, rustling sounds continued to resound, as if a storm was about to come. Tien also sensed the presence of someone approaching. Suddenly a cold wind blew against him, carrying a strong force, almost knocking him backwards. Tien tried to keep himself from falling, still standing still chanting the incantations. What did you summon? Who did you want to summon? Do you believe I will strangle you to death? The cold voice like a razor pierced deep into his soul, making his face pale as paper, his heart filled with terror. The sound was extremely piercing, making the air so oppressive that it was hard to breathe. Tien tried to raise his head to look, and discovered in the thick darkness. A woman's figure appeared. She was wearing a blue shirt, her long hair was hanging down, covering her face, standing tall in front, her arm pointed straight at him with an extremely angry expression. Tien was startled and stepped back, feeling that what he summoned was not what he was looking for, and immediately wanted to cancel it. Suddenly realizing that she was running towards him, Tien frowned in surprise. Does she really want to kill me? Seeing her figure like a madwoman, Tien suddenly felt a hard-to-dispel anger. Without finishing the spell, he just picked up a nearby broom, stuck a red talisman on it, and rushed straight in. Her hideous claws and dirty face were covered in blood and flesh. Her face was so white that there was not a trace of blood color. She bared her sharp fangs and charged forward, as if she wanted to tear Tien apart. Tien swung the broom in his hand, hitting her straight on her messy hair, making her scream in pain. Ay! Inside the house, Mr. Lan and his wife were stunned when they saw this scene. They only saw Tien holding a broom and waving it around in the yard, as if he was chasing someone away. They looked at each other in surprise, not understanding what Tien was doing in the yard. Old lady, are you trying to scare me? Thinking of her intimidating appearance, he felt angry again. He paused for a moment, rolled up his sleeves, and continued to swing the broom down to hit her repeatedly. Ay! I will curse your family. Curse. Before she could finish her sentence, her wide-open mouth was smashed by the broom, blood, flesh, and fangs mixed together. The more he hit, the weaker her figure became. Tien's eyes widened in surprise. It turned out that hitting a ghost could still make her soul fade away. If he hit any further, would even the ghost be beaten to death? But that kind of talisman can only be drawn once, and it will take 3 months before it can be drawn again. After hitting until his hands were tired, feeling the soul in front of him was too weak to bear it, he had no choice but to let go and forgive that soul this once. She was also scared and ran away, no longer looking as angry as before. After this, tomorrow I will go to Mr. Fong's factory to understand everything better. His parents also ran out to ask about what had just happened. Tien honestly explained to them. In front of him were 2 bundles of incense still in his house, sealed with a spell, afraid that something would happen to his family. After the incense factory became more and more prosperous, Mr. Fong also saved some money. The only son named Tai saw his father's business in the countryside growing more and more prosperous, so he quit his job and came back to help Mr. Fong manage the store and the books. During those 3 months, the factory's revenue increased rapidly. Even Tai was surprised. Only Mr. Fong knew clearly that all of this was due to the incense containing human corpses, which was why the factory prospered so quickly. The powder mixed with Mrs. On's body was almost gone. There were still a few kilos left. Mr. Fong diluted it, hoping to make more incense sticks. Although the scent was not as good as the original ones, it still had a distinctive aroma. Tai came back to help for 3 months, then continued to go to the city to apply for a driving course, holding 20 to 30 million in hand, planning to stay there to study and find a job until he finished school and then return. Because he saw that the factory's revenue was increasing steadily. In just 1 or 2 years, he would be the richest in this area. But now he thought it was still early. He should study first and get a degree, so that if he became rich in the future, he would have to buy a car to drive, to gain face with friends and relatives around. At that time, he was the only one left in the factory. Luckily, he was able to hire an accountant with a salary of 2 to 3 million. Thanks to that, Mr. Fong felt a little better, and his life was a little lighter. After a while, the remaining powder was also processed. Mr. Fong completely relieved his burden. All of Mrs. On's bodies were taken care of. He was no longer worried or anxious, and slowly switched to selling normal incense. Soon it was pitch dark, and in the workshop there was only Mr. Fong with a small lamp, just enough to shine on his desk. Mr. Fong was still sitting there, looking through the books and the money he had earned today. While he was struggling, suddenly a clattering sound rang out inside the workshop, startling him. He quickly looked outside, only seeing the dim flashing lights of the altar of the local god. There was no one else around. He thought it was a cat or mouse running around causing something on the machine to fall, so he didn't pay much attention. As Mr. Fong bent down to take notes, the dough mixer in front of him suddenly revealed the figure of a woman. She sat on the machine, her expressionless face turned towards him and looked straight. Her eyes were red and gloomy. Even the surrounding space began to grow cold. Mr. Fong felt his shoulders heave. A chill ran down his spine, as if some ghostly hand was touching him, so cold it cut his skin. Mr. Fong was startled, turned around and found that there was no one behind him. Around the incense factory there was nothing strange, only the air was still cold and gloomy as before. He quickly ran to the light switch, turned on all the lights, and only then did the atmosphere return to normal. Mr. Fong sat down in fear and gasped for breath. His chest kept pounding. Fuck! If you die, how can you threaten me? As a Buddhist, he also had some faith in ghosts and demons in this world. Mr. Fong felt the unusual atmosphere and immediately knew that something was present. His suspicions about Mrs. On's ghost grew stronger, and he was a little worried that she would come back to harm him in revenge. As soon as it was light, he ran to find a master to ask for some talismans to bring back and stick them around the workshop and in the house where he lived. When Tien arrived, it was already 9 o'clock in the morning. From outside, he could feel the thick air covering the entire house. Seeing that there were quite a few people busy working, Tien slowly walked into the workshop. What surprised him was that there were unexpectedly talismans posted inside. Ironically, they were all fake talismans. They had no magical power at all. The lines were clearly drawn randomly. Seeing that, he couldn't help but shake his head in disappointment. Even if the old man posted these talismans, it would be useless. Hey, who are you looking for? Suddenly a woman in the neighborhood recognized him and ran over to ask. I came to buy incense. Is Mr. Fong here? Tien replied. Buy incense? Go to the accounting desk, go there and ask for it, and they will give it to you. Mr. Fong just came back from having coffee with his friends. He came back around an hour ago, she said, then pointed straight inside. Tien also nodded in agreement, slowly walking to the desk. When passing by some machines, he suddenly felt a shock but quickly calmed down. Who are you looking for? Suddenly a soft voice rang out. Tien turned around and suddenly discovered that it was a girl around 25 or 26 years old, relatively tall, about 1 meter 57 or 58, a whole head shorter than him. But on her forehead, there appeared a vortex of evil energy. He looked at her suspiciously for a long time, making the girl a bit embarrassed, and asked again. Who are you looking for? I'm looking for Mr. Fong to buy incense, but he's not here. Can you let me choose some, and buy some to take home? Tien said. Yes. Follow me, there are many types here. Which one do you want to buy? The girl led him to some cardboard boxes, containing many different types of incense, carefully introducing each type and model. Tien looked for a while, but there was no black incense, so he asked, what kind of incense is black, and there is no black incense? Yes. There are 2 types, one is black incense, the other is the new incense that came out a few months ago, and that incense just ran out yesterday. Which one do you want? The girl replied, Black incense? Let me see, he said curiously. Yes, it's this bundle. Soon the girl came out holding a bundle of black incense, but he couldn't smell the smell of blood from this incense. He shook his head in disappointment. This is not the kind. I want to see the kind of incense that retains its fragrance for a long time and has the effect of repelling flies and mosquitoes. The girl heard that and suddenly smiled and replied, "That type is out of stock. It seems like the ingredients haven't arrived yet. Do you want to buy other types? Then get me this kind of incense." He held the bundle of incense, weighing nearly a kilo in his hand, then chose it. After all, he had come all the way here, so he couldn't leave empty-handed. "Yes, it's all 130. Crow. This one is dozens more expensive than the other one." Tien asked in surprise. "Yes, agarwood incense is more expensive, but that incense is new so it's a bit cheaper, about 100,000 per kilo," she said. "Okay. D, get me this bundle." Tien nodded in agreement, carrying the bundle of incense home. When passing by the mixer, he couldn't help but look back. Obviously, when he went in just now, he felt like there was a problem with the machine, but now it was nowhere to be seen, making him a bit suspicious. Out of the door, Tien's figure also disappeared from sight. In the following days, after selling out the incense bundles mixed with Mrs. On's body, Mr. Fong's workshop suddenly became deserted. Even he could not have expected it, and had a headache over this problem, sitting every night wondering why it had become like this, or was it because the body was mixed and that the incense workshop prospered? Mr. Fong sat at his desk, looking for a way to greet the traders who came, constantly calling to ask. Some people asked when the factory would sell that kind of incense again. He only dared to say vaguely that it would be available again in about 10 days or half a month. But even he had no way of making this kind of incense, because he only made it out of impatience and anxiety. He didn't expect that such an unscrupulous thing would have so many people asking, especially those who had transferred a deposit in advance. Now that there was no goods, he would definitely have to throw away all that money. Even Mr. Chien, Mrs. On's husband, came to ask to buy it, making him even more of a headache. If we do not find a way to restore the relationship, sooner or later the incense factory will fall into a slump like before. While he was scratching his head in thought, he suddenly noticed that the surrounding lights had gone out. Mr. Fong was secretly surprised. Could it be that there was a power outage? He quickly lit the oil lamp and groped his way to the electrical cabinet. He saw that the red indicator light was still on, the circuit breaker had not been turned off, and strangely the electricity around the house had not come back on. "Oh shit, the fuse must have blown," Mr. Fong said sadly. He was going to find another wire, then open the fuse and replace it with 2 or 3 copper wires to last him through the night. While he was searching, he suddenly felt a cold air blowing in his direction, making him shiver. Mr. Fong startled and turned to look into the darkness. In the workshop at this time, except for the gloomy black color, there was nothing else to see. The oil lamp was only enough to light up a small area, and in that quiet moment, he felt the presence of something that did not belong to this world. The darkness was as thick as endless black ink. From somewhere, the old woman's hoarse whisper sounded, like the wind whistling through the cracks of old walls. Mr. Fong stood still, his eyes wide with fear as the old woman's vague image appeared. She was standing in the darkest corner of the workshop, where the light could not reach. The old woman, with wrinkled skin and blood-red eyes, smiled strangely. Her dry laughter echoed in the space, making the air even colder and more terrifying. Mr. Fong felt every hair on the back of his neck stand up. His breathing became rapid and heavy. The entire incense workshop suddenly became a ghostly space, where time seemed to stop. Every small sound was enough to make his soul sink into the abyss of horror. She slowly walked over. The sound of her footsteps resounded loudly, as if she was stepping on his chest. He was so scared that his face turned pale. He wanted to retreat far away, but found that his legs were tightly held and he couldn't move. His whole body stiffened as he watched her figure walking towards him. The closer he got, the clearer he could see her face and figure, a short figure wearing an old blue outfit with blood stains on it. Her face was so crushed that even the skull inside was clearly visible. The corner of her mouth curled up into a ghostly smile, stretching to her ears, revealing rotten flesh. Mr. Fong stood there, frozen in place, his eyes wide open as he watched her figure walk towards him. Under the flickering oil lamp and that disgusting figure, it created a scene that was hard to dispel the fear in his heart at this moment. When the fear reached its peak, Mr. Fong almost fainted on the spot. His body began to tremble, and a series of muffled moans came from his mouth. Ghost! Ghost! She stepped forward, getting closer to the oil lamp, revealing her pale, dirty face even more. Her smile was so evil that anyone who saw it would be afraid. Suddenly, a ghostly sound echoed into Mr. Fong's ears. The hoarse, dry sound was like something was blocking his throat, making it extremely difficult to speak, but hearing it gave him goosebumps. I crave meat. I crave meat so much. Go get me some meat. I bless you with a prosperous business. Mr. Fong's breathing became more and more difficult. Sweat began to bead on his face, and he stammered in fear. You. Who are you? Why? Why did you appear and scare me? Who am I? I am Tian's wife. He killed me then. Then he used my soul to make a spell. He promised to feed me with meat. But he only fed me for a few meals. He sold me. Now I'm so hungry. I crave meat. I crave meat so much. Her voice kept ringing in his ears. The sharp sound like a knife made his eardrums feel like they were about to be punctured. It made him even more scared. He swallowed a mouthful of saliva and asked, When did I buy you? If you want to eat something, go find her. I don't know you. You bought that dough mixer from her. That machine is mine. Didn't you feed me? On's meat is delicious. Her soul is also delicious. Now I'm hungry. Find me something to eat. I bless you. The cold voice like an ice cellar rang out, making him jump in fear, remembering the things he had done before. Just now understanding the whole reason, it turned out that he had accidentally fed that machine human flesh. Now that he had sold that incense, it appeared and wanted to eat more. I have nothing left to give you to eat. You go somewhere else, he stammered. Don't you want to be rich? I'll help you get rich, you just need to feed me meat. She said as she looked upstairs, slowly walked past him, and then went straight up the stairs. As she passed by, he smelled the strong smell of blood and corpses, and the scent of incense. At first, he thought she had left, and was about to let out a sigh of relief, but suddenly he remembered something. His eyes widened to their fullest. He tried to turn his numb head, looked at her back as she walked up the stairs step by step, and shouted loudly, You! What are you doing up there? The black figure stopped in the middle of the stairs, turned her head 180 degrees, and glared at Mr. Fong, her voice cold. I smell the meat up there. The meat smells so good. I'll go up there to eat. Mr. Fong's eyes were bloodshot, because up there on the attic was his bedridden wife. Did that demon want to go up there to eat his wife? Thinking about the scene of her being gnawed by the demon, he felt even more furious. He used all his strength to escape the invisible shackles that were holding his body, but he could only helplessly watch the demon step by step up. His heart was bleeding. He felt like he had never been as helpless as today, watching it walk into his and his wife's bedroom. A painful and miserable scream rang out. The sound echoed from upstairs, causing his heart to stop, his breathing to choke in his throat, and tears of extreme pain welled up in his eyes. The scream was long and sharp, piercing his heart. Mr. Fong struggled even more fiercely, and soon broke free from the bonds. Regardless of the hideous figure of the demon standing there, he quickly rushed up the stairs and kicked open the door. Under the moonlight shining through the window, the scene before his eyes made him even more stunned. He only saw his wife lying stiffly on the bed, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. Her hands that were not moving were raised high, clinging, as if she wanted to tear someone apart. Black liquid flowed from the corners of her mouth, accompanied by a strong stench. Regardless of how terrifying the scene was, he quickly ran over and hugged his wife's body, sobbing loudly. Wife, sobi, sobi, sobi. Suddenly in that dark room, a bone-chilling cold wind blew in again, and the figure of that evil woman appeared again. She stood near the window. Although the moonlight was bright, it still couldn't clearly illuminate her figure. It was still just a dark, creepy black. Mr. Fong raised his head, his eyes filled with tears. He pointed his arm straight at the demon in front of him and roared, so angry that every vein was visible. It was you. It was you who killed my wife. Ha ha ha. Your wife is about to die, so I'll send her off for a while. Don't you want to think about the future anymore? She's dead, you'll be more comfortable. Her gloomy voice continued to ring out, along with her haunting laughter, gradually condensing the space. Even Mr. Fong felt a chill down his spine. She continued to entice him. Give her body to me. I'll release your wife's soul. Give her a chance to reincarnate, and help you become richer. Mr. Fong was originally angry, but after hearing that demon finish speaking, he could only keep silent and fall into deep thought. He had indeed thought about the troubles after taking care of his wife, always hoping that she could be freed soon, to save himself from having to suffer from thoughts in the future. Now that his wife had breathed her last, although it was the demon's doing, he should have been happy, considering it as having released the burden he had been carrying for so long. The more he thought about it, the more he wavered. The demon took the opportunity to add, Now that it's dead, aren't you freer? Give it to me. You can do whatever you want in the future. Haha. If you want money, you'll have money. If you want beautiful girls, you'll have beautiful girls. Spend it all you want. Mr. Fong should still have some sense, but being stuffed by her made him start to think differently. For the past few decades, he had been struggling to take care of his sick wife alone, without a single complaint. There were times when he was so desperate that he fell ill, but who could he confide in? His wife, besides being bedridden, couldn't even speak clearly. He could only watch helplessly, making him more and more bored. Every time he was home, he didn't dare to look at her for long. He didn't even say a word to her every night, just being cold all year long. He also loved his wife very much. Since she got sick, he didn't dare to date anyone, always keeping himself to himself to take care of his wife and children. Now that his wife was dead, he could be free and do whatever he wanted without worrying about anything. That night, Mr. Fong was completely convinced by the demon, and with the money clouding his humanity, he dragged his wife's body straight to the back of the house, only to hear the sound of chopping on the chopping board. Just like that, her body was cut into many pieces by Mr. Fong, then ground into a pile of mushy meat. The next morning, the accountant named Fong was the first to arrive at the factory. Seeing that it was already past 6:30, but no one had come to open the door, Mr. Fong had usually woken up early. She wondered and quickly picked up the phone and called him, only to hear each beep and then stop. Just as he was at a loss for what to do, the door suddenly opened. Stepping out was Mr. Fong with a somewhat pale face and pale skin. Fong was surprised, curiously, asking him a few questions, but he only said that he was busy working overtime that night and couldn't sleep. As soon as she entered the workshop, she suddenly saw the door behind the warehouse suddenly closed tightly. Feeling strange, she asked, "Why is the warehouse closed? Why don't you open it?" Mr. Fong calmly replied, "The warehouse is full. Last night the truck carrying the materials came to put them in there. Now it's full. When the workers come, tell them to leave them outside for a day or two. I'll clean them up and then work." Yes. Fong heard that and trusted her, didn't doubt anything, and still did her job properly. But hey, later someone called to ask about that type of incense. They said the price is now up to 200 and something per kilo. If they asked why the price went up, you said that the materials are rare, so the price is a bit expensive. If they can buy it, they can buy it. If not, they shouldn't bargain. Mr. Fong quickly instructed, then looked at her with a strange look, making Fong a bit stunned. She didn't understand what he meant by looking at her with that look. She was curious and asked, "What's wrong, uncle? And how old are you this year, Fong?" "Yes, 27. She answered vaguely. 27? Not young anymore." He pondered for a moment, then asked, "Do you have a boyfriend yet?" "Yes." "No, uncle." Fong was surprised. What did Mr. Fong actually want to say? She felt extremely confused. "Because I have a son who is also single, so I just asked, it's okay." Mr. Fong knew he shouldn't ask too many questions, so he tried to explain. Fong nodded in understanding after hearing this, but could only smile and let it go. She had never met him before, so how could she dare to casually agree to a match? Even though she was from a wealthy family, she did not seek someone for no reason, just because of money. At the very least, it had to be someone who loved her wholeheartedly. Time passed quickly. In that month his workshop grew rapidly. There was a lot of money left to deposit in the bank. The rest was used to buy necessary items while working. During this time Ms. Fong was often bothered by Mr. Fong constantly, asking when she would get married, what her hobbies were. This made her feel a bit disgusted with him. At first, she thought he was looking for a daughter-in-law for her son, but gradually she realized that the truth was not like that. Many times he kept asking her to go to places where there were no people, asking her to eat and drink. She firmly refused this offer, also intending to quit her job to find another job, but unfortunately her family was also in trouble, and she urgently needed money to support her family. If she quit her job, it would be difficult to find another job quickly. But if she kept working at his factory, she would soon be unable to bear it. Mr. Fong stuck to her like glue, causing the servants to focus their eyes on Fong, and there were even rumors that she and he were having an illicit relationship. Fong expressed her anger many times, but it did not subside at all. Mr. Fong, on the other hand, did not care much and seemed to enjoy hearing those words. It makes her more and more stressed, and going to work is not very fun. Today was like every day. The workers had all gone home early. Fong still had to stay a little longer to take inventory of the machines and goods for the day. It was almost 6 p.m. now. She took inventory of the goods, Mr. Fong looked after the books. Each person had their own job. While she was struggling, suddenly Mr. Fong came from somewhere and quickly hugged her from behind, causing Fong to jump in shock and try to struggle out of his grasp. She screamed, "What are you doing, uncle?" At this moment, old Fong revealed his true nature and said, "This little girl, what a beautiful person. I thought you were cute, so I came to hug you a bit. You're an adult and still do such things?" Fong felt disgusted with his actions, angrily glaring with her eyes and shouting, "What are you saying? I treat you like my own child. I love you so much," he quickly explained, but his eyes could not hide his greed and desire. As soon as he spoke, the main door of the workshop suddenly closed automatically, making the entire space pitch black, causing Fong to panic and feel like she was about to cry. You dare lock me in here and do something bad, I will scream for the neighbors to come." "Humph! Let me tell you, once I want something, no one can stop me." His tone changed 160 degrees, still the same low voice, but his face revealed a fierce look, completely different from what she usually saw. Fong was scared and ran straight out of the workshop. Suddenly, she found that her legs couldn't move. She looked down and saw two bloody hands holding her tightly. She panicked and cried out loud, trying to scream for help so that people outside could hear and run in, until her throat was hoarse. Is there anyone? Save me! Save me! Hoo, haha. You don't drink the offered wine, but you want to drink the penalty wine." Mr. Fong laughed evilly, accidentally revealing his white teeth, making Fong feel like she was falling into an abyss. She tried to scream loudly, but it seemed like no one outside could hear her. Even though her throat felt like it was about to burst, no one came to save her. She cried out in despair, "Haha, haha. Once you're done, give me the body." Suddenly, a ghostly sound rang out in the darkness. Fong turned her head and saw a dark figure standing right in the warehouse, his face covered in blood. This sight left her almost speechless. "Just heard," Mr. Fong said with an annoyed expression. "All right, wait until I get bored, and then I will give it to you to deal with. Right now, my wife's body hasn't even been made into incense yet. Wouldn't it be a waste to kill her?" "Haha, you men are all scum," she laughed gleefully and said. "Humph, it's the same." Old Fong coldly snorted, then her figure disappeared, only to see him slowly walking closer to Fong, with an extremely lustful expression. Fong was extremely scared and kept begging Mr. Fong to forgive her, but he did not forgive her easily. In the darkness, only her cries could be heard echoing tragically. The weather today is extremely hot. It's almost evening, but it's still terribly hot. Walking in the middle of the street, you can feel the heat, let alone during the day. I heard that a few days ago a guy went for a walk in the blazing sun and ended up dying of heat stroke. But when it comes to death, no matter what you do, you'll die. You'll die sleeping at home. You'll die riding a motorbike, a car, a plane, even a bicycle. After walking for a while, Tien felt his legs starting to get tired. He just wished some rain would fall to soothe his soul at this moment. Just as he was lamenting, suddenly from afar, a figure appeared, running towards him in panic. Looking closely, it was a girl, only to see her hand tightly holding onto her shirt to cover her exposed skin, continuously running towards him. As if she was afraid of someone, he hurriedly ran over to see the situation, only to realize that this was the accountant of Mr. Fong's factory. Why is her body so tattered? Her face has a bright red handprint, and tears are falling down her cheeks. "Hey girl, what's the matter? Why are you so panicked?" Fong ran and cried as she ran. Seeing a figure in front of her, she hurriedly ran towards him. Her intuition told her that he was not a bad person. She quickly hid behind him with an extremely scared expression. Tien was filled with doubt, looking at the torn clothes, some places revealing smooth white skin, making him a bit overwhelmed. But he still managed to calm his emotions, quickly took off the windbreaker and gave it to the girl to wear, worriedly asking, "Miss, what happened? Why are your clothes so messy?" Mr. Fong. Ghost. There is a ghost chasing after him." Fong was panicked and scared, her hand pointed behind her, her voice sobbing. She kept pulling his shirt as if she wanted to leave this place as soon as possible. Although Tien did not understand what the girl meant, he still took her to find a place to take refuge, in the middle of a deserted field where few people passed by. Luckily, there was no one there, otherwise people would think that he had done something lewd to her. He intended to take her home, but seeing her like that, he had to give up that thought. Luckily, near the rice field with a large lotus pond, there was a relatively enclosed camp. He took her there for temporary shelter, and called her family to come pick her up. After a while waiting for her to calm down, he turned on the flashlight and asked, "What happened just now? Why do you look so disheveled?" Fuang was a bit hesitant at first, but after a while, she told him everything from beginning to end. Tian's face became solemn after hearing this, not expecting such a horrifying story to be behind it. "You said Mr. Fang's house has ghosts?" "Yes. I escaped from there and ran here." Fuang thought back and was still scared, so she nodded and said, "So how did you escape him?" Thinking of this, he suddenly became a bit curious. How could an ordinary person like Fuang escape the demon? There must be some reason. "It was because of the jade my grandmother gave me when I was little. It saved my life." Fuang showed him the jade hanging around her neck, accidentally revealing her fair skin under the flashlight of her phone. Tian fixed his eyes on the ground, not even taking his eyes off the ground, his face full of concentration as he nodded and said, "What a good thing! But does this thing really ward off evil spirits?" Fuang was surprised, discovering that his eyes were not focused on the jade pendant on her neck, but somewhere on her chest. She quickly covered her collar in defense, her face turning white and green. This thing can indeed ward off evil spirits. It has strong yang energy, but it's not cheap. It must have been imported from abroad." Tian withdrew his gaze and spoke slowly. "Call your family to pick you up. It's not safe for the two of you to stay here." She didn't need him to remind her to call her family, but when she was about to call, she suddenly felt an indescribable suffocation around her, along with the smell of blood rushing into her nose. She looked at Tian in panic, as if she wanted to say something. Only saw Tian's face become serious, his eyes looked into the distance, his voice cold. "The smell of blood is so strong." "It's her! She's here!" Fuang cried out in panic. He frowned. Luckily he still had a few charms and a bell on him, so he could still temporarily protect the two of them. The wind began to pick up, growing stronger and stronger, accompanied by a low howling sound. In the distance, a dark red current of air was pouring toward this camp. Tian gripped the bell tightly in his hand, his spirit stretched to the limit. I'm scared," Fuang said, sitting huddled in a corner, hugging her body in fear. "Don't worry, once the danger passes you will be safe." He quickly spoke up to advise, and at the same time took out 4 or 5 talismans that he had brought along as backup. Most of them were yellow, and their magic power was relatively good, but not that strong. The sorcerer outside did not know how to rank the talismans, but he himself knew that the yellow talisman was just a common one. The stronger ones were the blue and red ones, while the black one was an evil talisman, its power far surpassing the blue and red talismans combined. However, he did not have the ability to refine that special talisman yet, so he would wait until his magic power was proficient enough to create it himself. Tian stuck each of the talismans on the bamboo walls, in order to prevent the demon from entering and harming Ms. Fuang. Although she was wearing the blue jade pendant, it only had temporary protection. When the sun rose, the jade would absorb the essence of the sunlight, and then it would continue to have the ability to ward off evil spirits. But she had already used it once. The yang energy in that thing was very little left. It couldn't protect her safely. Outside, footsteps echoed faintly, as if someone was walking in the swamp. Tian turned his head to look into the distance, discovering the figure of a woman, her hair disheveled like a wanderer, surrounded by a gloomy red color, and also giving off a rotten smell of anise and blood. Each step made the ground seem to crack. The surrounding air condensed into a stream. The cold was enough to cut through the skin. "It's her again? Why did she become so terrifyingly strong?" Tian was surprised to recognize this woman. Even though it was a dark moonless night, her figure was still a black mass. Tian could confirm that it was the thing he had chased away a few months ago. But this time, it had become stronger than ever. "It's her! She's going to eat me." Fuang's arm trembled as she pointed out to the fields, her face extremely pale, her fear reaching its peak. She ran and hid behind Tian's back. "You said she ate Mr. Fang's wife?" Tian calmly asked. Yes, I clearly heard Mr. Fang and her talking to each other." She quickly nodded in response. "It seems that Mrs. On's death is related to this demon." Tian's expression became more serious, he muttered to himself. At this moment, she was almost at the camp. Her eyes were red as fire, staring into the thatched house, her voice echoing like the dark forest, hoarse and dry, just like a person with pneumonia about to die. "Fuang, come out, I will pick you up. I miss you so much." Fuang sat in the house, her body shaking violently. she was so scared that she burst into tears. From childhood to adulthood, she had never seen such a terrifying scene. Old hag! If you die, then go reincarnate. At least you have some virtue. Who are you scaring by appearing in the middle of the night? Tien shouted loudly, making her stunned. Realizing that it was the person who had hit her a few months ago, her eyes became even more red with anger. It's you! You dare to ruin the party. I'll bury you all together. The sound had just stopped when a cold wind suddenly blew strongly. It seemed to want to blow away the tent, but strangely, no matter how strong it was, it could not shake it even a little. Old hag! Haven't you eaten enough that you're so weak? You're so useless. Tien's sarcastic voice rang out from inside. Even though her face was already pale, she still had to pull her face down to reveal an angry expression. You bastard! Wait until I break your spell. I will eat you first. Suddenly she appeared near the shack, her two hands continuously scratching at the wall. Each cold rustling sound made Tien's skin crawl. This old lady is still as vengeful as a leech even after death. Even more vengeful than a leech. Tien cursed inwardly, looking at the walls on all four sides that kept shaking back and forth, as if they were about to collapse. Luckily there were a few talismans protecting them, otherwise they would have been torn apart by her long ago. But if this is not the way, he quickly turned to look at Fuang and asked, Have you called your family yet? Not yet. Not yet. My phone suddenly lost signal, and I can't make calls. Fuang said fearfully. Mother, wait until we call them so they can come and claim the body. Tien was angry in his heart, cursing silently. Outside, that demon was still madly tearing at the camp. Some places had already been punctured. Tien immediately took out the bell and started chanting the same spell as when he defeated the evil wizard before, chanting and shaking it continuously. The clanging sound frightened the demon outside. It stopped scratching and ran away to watch. Feeling his arm getting heavier, he stopped to catch his breath. If the demon got closer, it would continue to do so until dawn. But whether he could shake it until dawn was still unclear. Outside the wind was still whistling coldly. Her dark figure still stood still, not moving at all, as if she was afraid of the sound just now. Seeing that, Tien also breathed a sigh of relief. At least he didn't need to waste energy shaking the bell in his hand. Where is she? Suddenly, Fuang looked far away and couldn't see her figure, so she was startled and asked Tien. Tien also looked outside. She was indeed gone, feeling strange, originally wondering why. Fuang, who was beside him, was curious and quickly stepped out to check. He saw that and was startled and cried out, Don't go out there! Fuang was stunned. Suddenly a black shadow pounced at her with extremely fast speed. It rushed towards her, grabbed her two bloody hands and claws. It was clear that she wanted to grab Fuang. She clearly saw her hideous face, pale as a sheet of paper, her dark red eyes carrying an expression of extreme anger. She screamed and pounced towards her. Fuang was so scared that she stood frozen on the spot. Her body felt like it was nailed to the ground. She could only watch as the dark figure rushed towards her. Tien quickly reacted, ran out to hug her and pulled her back inside, shaking the bell in his hand with all his might. As soon as she entered the door, she screamed in pain, quickly jumped away cautiously, her eyes filled with bloodshot veins. She was held in his arms. A strange and nameless feeling arose, causing her heart to beat wildly. Feeling the scent of the man embracing her, Fuang unconsciously felt a sense of safety, warmth, and also a bit of shyness. Peanut! That devil is so cunning. If I wasn't so quick, she would have been taken away by now. Thinking about the scene just now, Tien couldn't help but feel scared. If she was taken away by that old woman, even if he wanted to save her, he wouldn't be able to. Fuang felt ashamed of her recent actions. So she didn't dare say anything. She just sat next to him, hugging his long legs. Tien breathed a sigh of relief and said, Don't leave this place until morning, or I won't be able to save you. I don't have enough tools, otherwise I would have gone out and fought her. Are you a shaman? Fuang asked curiously. Tien stroked his nose and replied a bit smugly. You can see that. Oh, she replied perfunctorily, making Tien a little embarrassed. The sky was getting darker and darker, dyed in pitch black. The wind still rustled as if it wanted to blow the fragile tent apart. Even though she was nowhere to be seen, neither Fuang nor Tien dared to leave this house again. Once they stepped out, they might be taken away by that demon. Tien only relied on his 5 talismans and the bell in his hand. If one of them was damaged, it would put both of them in danger. During the time waiting for dawn, the two people continuously asked a few questions back and forth, as well as dispelling the gloomy and scary atmosphere, and learn some of the reasons behind Mr. Fong's workshop. The woman chasing the girl was actually a ghost in a dough mixer. She specialized in eating living people. Mr. Fong's wife was killed by him and the female ghost. Then the body was mixed with ingredients, creating a special type of incense with an extremely strong fragrance. As Fong spoke, her face became even paler with chills. Even she did not expect Mr. Fong to do such heartless things. Tian also guessed somewhat that female ghost must have been nurtured by Mr. Fong to help his business prosper. There are some businesses that, in order to become rich, do not think about the consequences, ask the master to capture and adopt a ghost in their house, considering it as a talisman. For example, the Kumanthan talisman. Besides this, Tian also knew the name of the girl, who was 4 years younger than him. Fong's house was 16 kilometers away from this village, also close to Tian's paternal home. His paternal home was in Ninh Binh. That girl also lived in the same commune, but in a different village. From his paternal home to her place was probably about 3 or 4 kilometers, not too far. After learning a little about Fong's background and circumstances, he also understood a little. The conversation soon turned into late night. Fong was tired and started yawning continuously. Tian was also very sleepy, but still had to try to stay awake all night. He didn't know when that devil would come. Fong looked around and saw nothing to rest her head on, so she felt a little disappointed. Seeing that, Tian immediately acted gallantly and pointed to his thigh. "If you're sleepy, go to sleep. I'll keep watch. If you have nothing to lean on, you can lie on my lap. You think so well." Fong glared at him. How could she not know what he was planning? Sleepy was sleepy, but she couldn't sleep lying on someone else, especially when the other person was a man. Fong took off the jacket he had just given her to lie down on. Now she was too tired. She was no longer shy or afraid. If Tian wanted to, he would have done it long ago. There was no need to sit there tiredly. Not knowing how long it took, Fong fell into a deep sleep. Tian sat next to her and watched, but his mood was still light and uncomfortable. A man and a woman together in the middle of the night in a deserted field also made him nervous and embarrassed. If it weren't for his goodwill, he would have fallen into human desires long ago. Closing his eyes and chanting Buddha's name for a long time, keeping his mind clear and calm, Tian did not let it think of bad things. Another half-hour passed. It was now 12:30 at night. Tian's eyes were heavy as if they wanted to close. He kept yawning. Eyes closed then opened then closed. Not knowing where from, a gentle breeze blew in, making him feel half asleep. His heavy eyelids drooped without him knowing. Suddenly, in his ears there were rustling sounds, like someone was dragging a heavy object on the floor, slowly dragging it away. Tian originally intended to close his eyes to sleep, but suddenly he woke up with a start, discovering a back wearing a blue shirt, with disheveled hair, tightly holding Fong's legs, dragging them away gently, as if afraid of waking someone up. Her feet were covered in blood, imprinted on the bamboo floor. The old man quickly grabbed the bell, rushed forward to hug Fong, and held her back, not allowing that dark figure to drag her out of the door, shouting loudly, "Damn it, how dare you kidnap someone in the middle of the night?" The old woman discovered that Tian had woken up, so she turned her head back 180 degrees, revealing a cold, bloody face. She was seen fiercely baring her sharp teeth. She screamed at Tian. Tian was terrified and quickly reached out to hug Fong's soft waist, while his other hand rang the bell, making a deafening sound. The old woman screamed in sharp pain, and her bloody hands quickly let go of the girl's legs, and she flew straight out. Strangely, while he and the old woman were struggling, Fong still did not wake up, but fell into a deep sleep. He wanted to put her back in her original position, but suddenly saw Fong rubbing her small head against his chest, making him stunned and speechless. Her two hands also reached behind his back, trying to hug him tightly, as if searching for warmth. Feeling the gentle scent of Fong's hair, his heart skipped a beat, and countless complicated emotions appeared in his heart. "Grandma, could it be that fate is coming?" Tian thought, and was moved to tears. Perhaps the ancestors above saw him complaining about everything. They must want to find someone to pair him up with. Thinking like that, Tian was not in the mood to enjoy the beautiful scenery, for now he was still on high alert, to avoid the incident just now from happening again. Throughout the cold night, Tian stretched his spirit to the limit, not daring to close his eyes for a moment, to the point that his eyes were dark and tired. It was not until the sound of a rooster crowing from afar that Tian finally let out a heavy breath, The previous night was truly torture for him. Fortunately, thanks to the guardian bell, he was able to escape this calamity. When the sky was bright, the 5 talismans around the wall suddenly burned to ashes without anyone noticing. Tien thought that perhaps they had burned long ago, before she came in to drag the girl away. The faint light of dawn shone directly into the camp, dispelling the bone-chilling cold of the night. Only then did Tien see the girl's face clearly. Fuang's black hair spread across her chest, each strand of hair as soft as silk. She lay peacefully in her sleep. Her pale skin under the morning sunlight radiated a mysterious beauty, like the gentle light of dawn rising. Her pink lips gently pursed, like a cherry blossom closing itself in the night wind. That delicate and equally beautiful face made Tien captivated and unable to blink. "Hey! Wake up, it's morning already. Are you going to lie inside me forever? I sat here last night until my legs were numb." Tien tried to shake her gently, calling out. Fuang had already woken up early, but because she felt embarrassed and didn't dare to wake up, she saw that the sky outside was already bright, and she escaped from his chest. Confused, she said, "Sorry, I fell asleep and didn't notice." "You slept well. I stayed up all night watching you until I was exhausted." Tien glared at Fuang, then stood up and stretched his sore back. "Thank you for helping me. How about I treat you to breakfast later?" Fuang was embarrassed and had to suggest. "Forget it. I still have to go home. To take care of everything, you should go home quickly, and don't tell anyone about the ghosts chasing you, or no one will believe you." He originally intended to have breakfast, but then thought that he needed to go home to do some work. So he refused Fuang's good intentions and didn't forget to give her some instructions. "I know," Fuang replied a little disappointedly. The two of them exchanged a few words, then went their separate ways. After returning safely, the first thing she did was go to the commune police station to report old Fuang for rape. Strangely, although she successfully reported the whole incident, when they came to arrest him, he only compensated Fuang with 20 to 30 million for mental damage, then detained him for 48 hours, but in the end, Mr. Fuang was still released and reintegrated into the community as before. This made Fuang extremely indignant. As for Tien, after returning home, the thing he needed to do most now was to go buy some small things. This time he would not let Mr. Fuang continue to harm anyone. As for bringing 2 bundles of incense containing Mrs. On's body to Mr. Tien's house, starting to explain the situation, to see if he could help her. If not, Tien would go to the city. In no time, he arrived in front of Mr. Tien's house. Looking at the large house in front of him, he could not help but feel overwhelmed. The couple had the property they had today because of their 2 sons. One was a big businessman opening a company, the other settled abroad. Every month, she sent the old couple tens of millions of dong, so Mrs. On had money to lend to people. The interest she collected was only over 1% according to the bank's interest rate, but there were still people who couldn't pay and planned to kill her. The 2 children were rarely at home. Only Mr. Tien lived in that house. Looking around, there was no one in the house, calling for a long time, but no one opened the door. Neighbors around said that after his wife passed away, Mr. Tien's eldest son felt sorry for him staying at home, so he called him to the city to live with his wife and him. He took the opportunity to help look after his nephew for a few days. After the business was finished, the whole family would move down here to live, and conveniently hold a funeral 100 days later. When he left, Mr. Tien asked his free cousin to come over to clean and burn incense for Mrs. On. Every month, he sent somewhere around 5 or 7 million dong. After hearing that, Tien understood that before leaving, he asked the neighbor to give 2 bundles of incense to Mr. Tien's cousin, and told him not to burn them. The neighbor was initially curious but accepted it, seeing that Tien strode away. He considered his favor for Mrs. On to stop here. Whether his cousin would do as Tien said or not was another matter. Not being able to meet Mr. Tien, he had no choice but to return home, trying to find out more information in that mysterious book. When passing the tamarind tree, Tien suddenly shivered. Goosebumps appeared in waves. His eyes looked out in panic towards the tree. Even though it was now daytime, only 8 or 9 in the morning, he could still feel the cold air coming. Tien stood observing the tamarind tree for a while, a place that contained so many painful memories and death. Suddenly he realized that from deep underground, there were clumps of red smoke rising. He quickly used his 8th soul, discovering that the barrier circle on the ground had begun to crack, like a piece of tempered glass about to explode. Smoke continuously escaped from the cracks, giving off a strong smell of blood. Before his eyes was an even more terrifying scene, blood gushing out from underground like an underground stream, submerging the entire space in a sea of blood. The water reached his toes, the fields of the past were nowhere to be seen, only a vast sea of blood remained. Suddenly, Tien heard wailing sounds around him. The sound seemed to tear his eardrums. Under his feet, corpses floating on the water, old and young, women and men alike. Everyone's face was pale, their eyes were wide open and lifeless, looking up at the sky. Tien was scared and hurriedly retreated far away. In just a few short seconds, thousands of corpses were floating on the lake's surface, so many that there was no end in sight. Tien's face turned pale. He hurriedly chanted the spell and shook the bell. In his hand, the surrounding space immediately returned to normal. The scenery was still the same. There was no terrifying scene like just now. It was still the tamarind tree under the bright sunlight peacefully. But his heart was not at all relaxed at this moment. On the contrary, it made him even more worried and uneasy. The illusion just now was a warning of the impending disaster. 2 years had passed since he picked up the bell. Perhaps the thing underneath was about to break the seal and escape. Tien returned home with a heavy heart, starting to research a method to find Mrs. On's soul, as well as learn some magic to be on the lookout after the demon underneath the tamarind tree escaped. A few days later, the villagers saw Mr. Fong's son return home, but he wandered around for 3 or 4 days without leaving the house. Mr. Fong told him that he had gone back to the city that evening and would be back in a few days. Although everyone was a bit suspicious, no one dared to ask any further questions. This matter finally reached Tien's ears. After several days of searching, he found a way to summon the soul. However, this method could only call back loved ones in dreams, and could only be used once. That night he prepared everything and continued to perform the spell. At the same time, Mr. Chien and his 2 sons had the same dream. They saw thousands of incense sticks dancing in front of them. While dancing, they heard mournful sobbing sounds. Suddenly, a familiar woman's voice came from the incense sticks. She said she was their mother and wife, Mrs. On. A young shaman summoned her soul to meet the 3 of them. She slowly told them the whole story. The next morning, Mr. Chien and his eldest son still did not really believe in the dream last night. Suddenly they received a call from the youngest son abroad. His voice was low and restless. He told the dream to Mr. Chien and his son, and Mr. Chien got goosebumps as he listened. Because what the youngest son told was exactly the same as the dream he had last night, the eldest son gradually had a little more faith, and then he started to tell it exactly the same way. This time, Mr. Chien's family of 3 really believed that Mrs. On had returned to them in their dreams, and they were also angry at the inhumane actions of that old man Fong. What was even more cruel was that the father and his 3 children used incense containing Mrs. On's body, causing them to feel extremely guilty and tormented for the rest of their lives. Even though Mrs. On kept saying she forgave them, they would not forgive themselves. At home, Tien only heard rumors that Mr. Chien and his 2 children had gone to the police station to report the crime scene, asking them to come to Mr. Fong's house to re-examine the scene. After hearing that, Tien could only shake his head and sigh. If things were that easy, why would he need to perform a soul-calling ceremony? He had a female ghost by his side. The murder could be hidden, let alone some small clues. At this time, Fong also came up from home to see him, partly because she wanted to thank him for saving her life, and partly because she wanted to follow him to learn from him. However, Tien still did not agree, because he did not want his daughter to get involved in these spiritual things. He learned from her own mouth that after escaping from that evil old man, every night a demon would come to visit. Luckily, her mother gave her a talisman that was said to have a very powerful ability that could ward off evil spirits. So she was still safe until now. Mr. Fong must have threatened her a lot. He definitely wanted to kill her to silence her, but because of that talisman, he never made a move. Tien took a look. It was indeed very strong, stronger than he understood. Even current cultivation could not create such a talisman. It could be said that Fong was relatively lucky. Mr. Chien calling the police will definitely not be able to investigate anything. On the contrary, it will make Mr. Fong even more careful. Fong also heard people's rumors and quickly spoke up. Tien also nodded in agreement with her, sighed and said, "As long as that devil is by his side, it will be very difficult to find and convict him. Did you hear what the neighbors said the other day? Mr. Fong's son has been missing for a few days. Now, I'm afraid something bad is going on." Fong suddenly asked him, "I can't confirm this, but 80% of it is. His expression turned serious as he replied, then spoke again. If this continues, it won't be just a few lives. After listening, she nodded. If he was allowed to act recklessly, who knows how many people would die. If only we could find out where that demon came from, it would be easy. Tien Sight. The source? You mean the person who sold Mr. Fong that machine? Mr. Tien? Phoenix asked in surprise. Mr. Tien? Is this the person who sold to Mr. Fong? Tien was suddenly startled and surprised. He didn't know much about this, he only knew that someone sold the machine to Mr. Fong. That's right, when I worked for Mr. Fong, I heard him say that Mr. Tien's house in Village 6 in the town was for sale. Mr. Tien lives in Village 6? I should go there and take a look. He pondered for a moment, then decided to go find his house, hoping to get answers. That's not all Mr. Tien used to study shamanism. I heard it was some kind of Luban low beat sect, but after a few years he stopped working, just focused on staying home and opening a wood workshop, Fong said. Hearing that, Tien was a bit surprised, feeling that there was something strange here. As far as he knew, the shaman could not possibly not know that there was a soul in the machine. Meanwhile, it was his wife. Every shaman had a foundation, possessing the ability to see through ghosts and souls. If he already knew that the machine had her soul, why did he have to sell it? In the Lu Bang sect, the art of making magic spells is also extremely diverse. He only knows roughly that it originated from a Chinese master who specialized in carpentry. Then it poured into our country, developing more and more strongly, but after all these years, the sects have almost disappeared from the world. Perhaps the age of science is increasingly developing, causing the magicians to hide in the hustle and bustle of life full of complications. Do you think he killed his wife and then put her soul in the mixer to act as a guardian spirit? Fong suddenly made a guess, even Tien had to look at her with different eyes. He couldn't help but say Fong's guess was relatively accurate, very similar to what he was thinking. It's very possible. But, how do you know so clearly? Tien asked curiously. I've heard a lot of ghost stories before, so I know a little, she replied with a smile. Ghost stories just describe some basic information. In reality, it is scarier than it appears. You know so much, why don't you teach me a few basic moves? Fong took the opportunity to advance, her eyes sparkling like jade, looking at him without blinking. Tien's face turned red. He quickly coughed a few times and shook his head in refusal. Cannot. The reason why Fong was not allowed to learn the art of shamanism was because her soul was very weak. Although she rarely saw ghosts, every time she did, something dangerous would happen, like the incident a few days ago. That was why she had to wear a jade pendant to protect her. Thanks to that, she was able to keep her life until today. That day, Tien went down to town alone, with the purpose of finding Mr. Tien's house. They arrived in no time. This place was originally a rice paper making village. Every household did this job. At noon, when the sun was shining, there would be many bamboo stalls spread out along the road, with pieces of rice paper that were not yet completely dry. Tien also asked the people around here, and was shown the way to his house. Behind the old temple there was a small dirt path. At the end of the path he saw a big eggplant tree lying on the side of the road. Passing a few houses, he saw an open carpentry workshop. Inside the workshop was a spacious house. Originally intending to go in and say hello, suddenly his intuition told him not to go in. For some reason, he felt uneasy. After thinking carefully for a while, he decided to go inside to take a look. Since he had come here, he couldn't return empty-handed. Entering the carpentry workshop, he found 4 or 5 men busy working. As soon as Tien entered the door, he attracted everyone's attention. Who are you looking for? An elderly worker suddenly stopped what he was doing and asked, Is this Uncle Tien's workshop? Tien asked, still not forgetting to observe the surroundings. He discovered that the 4 walls of the carpentry workshop were covered with strange talismans, with extremely complex patterns. They were drawn overlapping each other without any pattern, and there were also some Chinese characters written on them. That's right, but he hasn't come back from measuring the furniture yet. If he has something to do, he can come back later. Otherwise, he can just wait a little longer. He said, No, I'll come back when I have time. Tien quickly said. The workers were also surprised, but they had their own work to do, so they didn't ask any more questions. As Tien stepped out of the door, he suddenly came face to face with a tall man. He smelled the scent of wood and PU paint coming from the man, and was startled for a moment. Suddenly the man walked over, his eyes still fixed on him, not waiting for Tien to ask. He spoke first. You want to find me? Come in and sit down. Mr. Tien had a pensive expression. Hidden behind that old face appeared the sadness of time. Although he couldn't see it clearly, he could feel it. Mr. Tien walked straight into the workshop. Tien was stunned for a moment, then followed him inside. He led him to the back of the house, and when he got to the back, the scene before his eyes surprised him. Behind the house was a small yard, about 7 or 8 square meters, with many kinds of vegetables planted on both sides. Nearby was a thatched hut, with tables and chairs neatly arranged. At the end of the fence was a fish tank and a large stone tomb, with lotus and water lilies planted on both sides, looking very beautiful. Water trickled down from the top of the mausoleum, revealing a school of koi fish floating on the surface. What surprised Tien the most was that beside the fish pond was a humanoid figure of a demon, with a ferocious head and 2 long, pointed ears, holding a large sword in his hand, looking fiercely in this direction. Looking more closely, he saw that in a corner of the wall not far away, there was a newly built tomb, overgrown with weeds that had not been cleaned up properly. Perhaps this person just died not long ago, and the mourning period has not ended yet, so the grass is still growing so much. Mr. Tien had already sat down and poured him a glass of cold water, because he never drank tea or coffee before, so he could only serve him water. "Sit down and have a drink, son," he said. "Thank you, uncle." Tien looked at him in surprise. It seemed like he knew why he came, and did not show any surprise or astonishment. "I know why you came here. Your wife told me on the way home," Mr. Tien calmly said, making Tien even more startled. "Wife? Your wife?" Tien asked in surprise. "Yes. You must be thinking that my wife is the devil in Mr. Fong's house." "No." Seeing his surprised look, Mr. Tien suddenly laughed and shook his head. Tien didn't say anything, just nodded as confirmation. He originally thought that thing was the wife of the man in front of him. If it wasn't, then who was that thing? Mr. Tien continued to tell. "That demon is actually something I caught when I was young and wandered around for a long time, probably more than 20 years ago. I locked it in a porcelain jar and placed it on the roof of the warehouse." Tien listened slowly. From this story he knew everything clearly. Specifically, the year Mr. Tien practiced his shamanic profession, he went to Ninthuan for a while and helped a family catch a demon. After catching that demon, he locked it in a porcelain jar as small as a fist. He carried it with him and continued to wander everywhere. It was not until he met and married Mrs. Chin, his wife, that the two returned to their hometown to get married and live until now. From then on he also quit his shamanic profession, opened a carpentry workshop to do business, no longer having anything to do with this profession. The jar containing the demon, he carefully placed it in the attic, pasted 2 or 3 talismans to seal it. He originally thought that he could safely imprison it forever, but unexpectedly one day, by chance, Mr. Tien was busy installing furniture for someone else's house. Mrs. Chin ran to the warehouse to clean it up, so that she would have a place to make incense in the future. Coincidentally, the mixer that had just been bought was still very new, somehow, accidentally caused the porcelain jar placed on the roof to fall to the ground and shatter. Mr. Tien, who was working far away, suddenly felt uneasy and hurriedly returned home. When he got home, he was shocked to find the broken porcelain vase on the floor and the amulets burned to ashes. His wife had been crushed to death by the fairy engine, her soul sucked into the air by something. Mr. Tien suppressed his grief and tried to save his wife's soul, but he could only save a third of it. The remaining was eaten by the demon. As for that demon, Mr. Tien tried every way but still could not find it, thinking that it was scared and ran away. Unexpectedly, it was hiding in the mixer, because he did not know, so he sold it to Mr. Fong. "I see. So do you know what happened in Mr. Fong's house?" Tien asked with a soft sigh. "I don't know, but I feel something is very strange." Mr. Tien shook his head. Then Tien had to tell him the whole story from beginning to end. The more he listened, the more startled and scared Mr. Tien became. If that demon had eaten the dead, no one would be able to fight it now, even when you were in your prime. Mr. Tien replied with a serious face. "Don't worry, I can defeat that demon. I came here partly to find out its origin, and secondly to see your opinion if that spirit belongs to Mrs. Chin." Tien replied. At first he did not take action because of Mr. Tien, if that was really his wife. Taking action would make him angry, plus she was also a shaman. The two of them would inevitably have a magic fight. Now everything was clear, his wife and that demon were 2 different things. Tien was no longer worried about anything. "How do I defeat that demon?" Back then, It was just a demon that I had to work hard to subdue. Now that it has eaten so many innocent lives, its energy is definitely thick and powerful. Defeating it is much easier said than done. Mr. Tien shook his head and said, he himself did not believe that a young man like Tien could punish that female ghost. He said again, there are only a few ancient sects that can defeat it, but these sects have been lost for thousands of years. Even Liu Ban and his followers have very few successors. Most of them only use basic spells. If you want to capture the female ghost, I have something that can help you a little, because I have the demon seal in my hand. What is the devil's seal, uncle? Tien asked in surprise. This was the first time he heard these two words. Wait a minute. After saying that, Mr. Tien went into the warehouse, quickly took out a cloth bag, put it on the table and slowly explained. After cultivating for hundreds of years, if the requirements are met, a demon will reach the night ghost realm. And every night ghost has a seal inside, called a demon seal. This is similar to a human heart, and it also proves one's status in the underworld. Night ghosts attach great importance to this seal, so they usually hide it very carefully. Almost no one can find it, except when they meet more skilled sorcerers. Taking the demon seal, the demon's power will also be reduced by more than half. I didn't expect this to happen. Tien opened his mouth in surprise. He had unintentionally learned more about the demons in the human world. If Mr. Tien said so, then the female demon inside Mr. Fong's house was the night demon? Why are you giving me this? Will it help cure the demon? Tien asked. Mr. Tien said in an uncertain tone. I don't know either, but holding it might scare the demon a bit. It won't dare to harm anyone around it. Then I will accept this. Thank you, uncle. He quickly took it in his hand, then expressed his thanks. If this thing was useful, it could not be ignored. Seeing Tien stuff the cloth bag into his pocket, Mr. Tien let out a heavy sigh, feeling more comfortable than ever. Is there anything else you want to ask? He asked. No, uncle. I'll ask your permission to go home early now. It's getting late. Tien happily replied. Mr. Tien nodded, then happily saw Tien out the door. The two of them greeted each other warmly, then turned and walked away. When Tien was halfway there, he suddenly stopped at a sidewalk cafe. His initially smiling expression suddenly changed 360 degrees. His eyes were cold as ice, and he whispered, Does he think I don't know anything about this? How funny. Mr. Tien was not a good person. Although what he said was true, when he gave him the cloth bag containing the devil's seal, he knew early on that things were not simple. Obviously, he wanted to throw the hot sweet potato into his hand, afraid that the demon would come back to collect the debt, so he hastily lied and gave it to Tien. He knew it clearly, but still deliberately accepted it, because it was useful in investigating the demon's background. He also did not leave Mr. Tien alone. He was clearly using a knife to kill someone. Before leaving, he left Anzora behind. He was sure that the female ghost would come to his house first. That night, the sky suddenly poured the first rain of summer. The rain poured down even heavier. The rustling sound of the wind made the dry leaves flutter. The air was both cold and gloomy, making the space become gloomy and creepy. Hey Tien, it's starting to rain. Let's sit down and drink a little more and then go home early. If we go home too late, my wife and kids will be a bit worried. A worker suddenly spoke up, seeing that the rain was still pouring. He was a bit worried about his wife and kids waiting at home. No one had brought a raincoat in the afternoon, and Mr. Tien had also enthusiastically invited them to drink, so they stayed to sit and play for a bit, while waiting for the rain to stop. The five of us drank from 5 in the afternoon until 8 or 9 at night, and we were all drunk. If it kept raining like this, we would have to wade through the rain. It's raining heavily outside. You guys will be soaked when you get home. Why don't you wait a little longer and see what happens? Mr. Tien looked out into the yard. The sky was starting to rumble with thunder and lightning. He was a bit worried about the workers. Not to say it was bad luck. If they were struck by lightning on their way home, he would be partly at fault. Stop it, Tien. If we stay here any longer, we'll get scolded by our wives, another person spoke up. The road was far. It would take at least a few minutes to get home. They were just worried that their wives would nag them, but when could they come home from a trip? I think the rain is about to stop. Wait a bit, and then go home. It's raining heavily and there's lightning outside. I don't feel safe going home. Mr. Tien still tried to persuade them, but unfortunately, there were no raincoats left in the house. There were only 2 raincoats, and his 2 daughters were wearing them to extra classes. They wouldn't get home until 9 or 10 o'clock. The 4 workers, seeing Mr. Tien's constant persuasion, had no choice but to pick up the phone and call his wife to come home late, and continued to stay a little longer, waiting for the rain to stop before running home. After all, today was Saturday, the weekend. Tomorrow was the day off, so it was okay to come home a little late. 5 people sat in front of the carpentry workshop, the bright electric light shining straight down on the floor, obscuring their shadows. Each person gathered together and talked animatedly. Suddenly, a cold wind blew into the workshop, bringing with it raindrops, causing the 5 people to jump. "Damn, sitting here and the rain still blows in," Mr. Tien cursed, hurriedly moving the table a little bit inside with the 4 others. Everyone found it strange. In the past, no matter how heavy the rain was, it did not blow over the porch, because in front of the workshop there was a long sloping roof, which could protect against the sun and rain from blowing in. Even a storm could not blow to such an extent. They had just sat down to talk for a short while when the wind blew inside again, soaking some of the machines. Mr. Tien was afraid that the rain would seep into the electrical wires in the workshop and cause a short circuit and fire, so he and everyone else moved inside the house and turned off the workshop's circuit breaker for safety. As soon as they entered the house, they suddenly heard 4 or 5 loud banging sounds, the sound coming from behind the porch. The 4 workers panicked and looked behind the warehouse, but saw no one. Tien's face became somewhat serious, as if he felt that something bad was about to happen. Bam! The lights in the house suddenly went out, leaving the space in pitch darkness. "That's it! The power's gone out," the old carpenter named Hai said dejectedly. Maybe the wind and rain were too strong, and the lightning was so loud that people were afraid the pole would burn down, so they turned off the main circuit breaker. Another person spoke up. Mr. Tien looked around the pitch-black space. A feeling of unease kept rising in his heart, and no matter what he did, he couldn't get rid of it, so he told everyone, "You guys run out to the warehouse, shine your flashlights, and find some oil lamps and bring them to me. I'll go find a bottle of oil first." The 4 of them also split up to search. 2 of them stayed in the house to help Mr. Tien find the kerosene bottle. As for Mr. Hai and Chi, they took the silver sheet and ran out of the rain to the back of the warehouse. The warehouse was now pitch black, with tables, chairs, and other belongings piled high. Moreover, the 2 of them didn't know where Mr. Tien had put his belongings, so they could only walk around and shine flashlights to search. They probably put them somewhere on a shelf for easy visibility. "Don't you find it strange, Hai? Normally, the warehouse is small, but when we came in here, it looked huge." Suddenly, Mr. Chi felt that the space was a bit strange, especially the warehouse had something unusual, so he asked, "Come on, man. The warehouse has been weird for a while now. What's so big or not big? Hurry up and find it and come back soon, because with this rain, I think it will take until morning." Mr. Hai was not as suspicious as Mr. Chi, so he clicked his tongue and said, but when he heard him, Mr. Hai also felt strange. Could it be that Tien had expanded the warehouse? Both of them also ignored the small matter. First they had to find the oil lamp and quickly return to the house, because staying in here was a bit creepy. Especially since the incident of Tien's wife being crushed to death in this warehouse. Thinking about this made both of them get goosebumps, hurriedly looking for the oil lamp. While he was searching, Mr. Hai suddenly felt something tickling his butt, so he jumped up in surprise and pointed to Mr. Chi next to him. "What kind of weird joke are you playing? Why don't you look behind me and squeeze my ass?" "What, man? Why should I squeeze your ass? I've been looking for it all this time. Your ass is as soft as porridge. Why squeeze it to make my hands itch more?" Mr. Chi was surprised and quickly shook his head in denial. Mr. Hai did not ask any more. He was sure that it was Mr. Chi who did it and no one else, because there were only 2 of them in the warehouse. If it was not Mr. Chi who did it, then who else? They continued to search around angrily. They had been looking for a while but still could not find the oil lamp. It was really strange. Not long after, Mr. Chi suddenly screamed loudly, "Hey man, why are you squeezing my boobs? It hurts like hell." Mr. Hai was also startled. He was clearly standing 2 or 3 meters away from Chi. His arms were not long enough to squeeze his breasts. Thinking about what happened to him just now, he suddenly felt a shiver. I was standing in here." Mr. Hai swallowed a mouthful of saliva. A chill ran down his spine, he said tremblingly. Hearing the voice coming from 2 or 3 meters away, old Chi stood frozen for a moment, a chill spreading to his bones. "Did you do it?" Mr. Chi still didn't dare to think about it, so he quickly asked again. "Why would I lie to you?" Mr. Hai still insisted that he did not do it. The 2 stood silently looking at each other for a moment. Although in the dark, only the flickering flashlight illuminated their faces, one could feel that the other was gradually becoming afraid. Come on, go inside." Mr. High panicked and hurriedly walked out the door, but suddenly he felt like his legs couldn't move. Surprised, he shined the flashlight below and suddenly saw clearly two bloody hands tightly holding onto his legs. Old Chi standing next to him also froze, his eyes wide open, his arms trembling, pointing behind Mr. High, his voice stuttering. There is a ghost." Mr. Chi was standing near the door, so as soon as he shouted, he ran straight into the house. Mr. High only had time to hear the word, ghost, echoing from afar, making him almost die. Suddenly a cold wind blew on the back of his neck, so cold that it almost froze him. He wanted to turn his head, but found that his whole body couldn't move and could only stand there. It was pitch black before his eyes. Even the flashlight was gradually fading, but he could clearly see a dark figure appearing in front of him. Step by step, the sound of footsteps on the tiled floor was heavy and low. Each step seemed to step on his chest, making his heart beat rapidly. The closer he got, the more terrified Mr. High became. His face paled to the point of losing all color, and even his heart stopped beating for a moment. The figure was that of a woman, wearing a purple outfit, with countless tears and mud on her body. Her face was extremely ferocious, her red eyes glowing in the night. Her gaze seemed to pierce her soul. Her skin was pale and bloodless. He could clearly see the blue veins on her face, along with a smile that stretched all the way to her ears, revealing the red flesh inside. Her gaze, her skin, and her smile all gave off a terrifyingly lifeless feeling. She stepped in front of him, pressing her face close to the disgusting, stinking corpse. Mr. High could clearly see every pore on it, the dead skin flakes. His fear reached its peak. At this moment he just wanted to faint. This horrible scene was truly beyond the endurance of an old man nearly 60 years old. Suddenly his eyelids grew heavy, and before his eyes closed he could only hear her hoarse, terrifying voice. "I want his whole family to die. I want him to die." Inside the house, Mr. Tien and two workers were struggling to find a bottle of kerosene when suddenly they heard a loud scream coming from behind the warehouse. The three of them quickly turned on their flashlights and ran out to see, discovering a dark figure running and stumbling, screaming loudly. There is a ghost in that warehouse. It took Mr. High away." Mr. Tien and the two others were surprised. They quickly ran to support Mr. Chi, who was as wet as a drowned rat and covered in mud. Mr. Chi's face was pale as a sheet of paper. "What happened that scared you so much?" the young worker suddenly asked, only to see Mr. Chi pointing towards the warehouse and stammering. Mr. High is scared of ghosts in there. Go in and take a look." Everyone looked at each other in surprise, their skin crawling, not wanting to go in there, because they knew clearly that Mr. Tien's wife had just died unjustly in the warehouse not long ago. Mr. Tien hesitated a bit, then boldly went inside, but before he reached the door he heard the sound of smashing things, accompanied by a billowing white smoke. "Oh no!" Tien realized something was wrong and rushed in. He was afraid that the talismans and some tools wrapped in the wooden box, if burned by that thing, would make it difficult for him to continue practicing his profession, especially when facing the female ghost that he had subdued years ago. Although the three of them managed to run into the warehouse in time, they discovered that the fire had started to burn the machines and furniture. Mr. High's eyes looked extremely intimidating, his face was wrinkled, and he looked extremely angry. He kept throwing tables and chairs everywhere. Seeing the three people approaching, Mr. High raised his voice and pointed his arm straight at Mr. Tien. More surprisingly, he spoke in a woman's voice, completely different from his usual warm voice. "You! Where did you hide it? Give it back to me, or I will kill you." Mr. Tien's face turned pale. He knew that Mr. High was possessed by the female ghost, and the wooden barrel had been burned to ashes. This time, he had no way to fight back. Worry and fear were clearly visible on his face. "I gave it to the young man this morning. If you want to find it, go to his house and look for it," Old Tien replied, surprising the two workers who still didn't understand what was going on. He was extremely curious. Why did the female ghost come here, when he had already given the ghost seal to the young man? The young man must have known that he had set a trap, so he used a special method to take away the ghost seal while leaving behind his aura, causing the female ghost to come here. The more he thought about it, the more terrifying his expression became. "Do you think I'm stupid? You locked me up for decades. Stole my demon seal. Give it back or I'll kill you all." Mr. High roared angrily, The cold sound made all three people's skin crawl. At the same time, the wind outside continuously blew strongly. Thunder and lightning struck down. Mr. Tien was scared and quickly took a few steps back, then quickly spoke up. "You go find it and get it, then we don't owe each other anything." "Ha ha ha! You must die. None of you can escape." The terrifying laughter and the sound of the depths of hell rang out, sending a chill down the three people's spines. Mr. Tien, having lost his tools, ran out of the warehouse like a dog in mourning. Before the carpenters could recover, they felt a cold blast of air hit them. They discovered that Mr. Hai had suddenly fallen to the ground, with fresh blood still coming out of his mouth, accompanied by a foul stench. After that, I only felt my eyelids tired, my head spinning. My body seemed to have lost strength and swayed a few times before falling to the ground. As for old Tien, he ran straight without looking behind him, but before he could run for long, he discovered that the workshop door had been closed tightly by someone from the outside, causing him to panic and continuously bang on the door and call for help. Behind, a tall black figure with glowing red eyes was flying towards this side. Her pupils were so cold that it made his heart freeze. The female ghost in purple AOBABA, her hideous face covered in blood and stench, she smiled widely, her sharp fangs exposed, making Mr. Tien feel terrified. The surrounding air became heavier and heavier, dropping to 0 degrees Celsius, the cold cutting through the skin like being immersed in an ice bath. The heavy feeling of oppression pressed down on his chest, as if it was about to explode. Facing him were a pair of bloodshot eyes filled with disgusting blood vessels. The stench of a long decomposed corpse wafted into his nose. He could only hide in a small corner of the room, his body trembling unceasingly. That dark night, the neighbors only had time to hear a scream coming from Mr. Tien's wood workshop. The scream sounded like a pig being stabbed, making the listeners' hair stand on end. When the rain gradually stopped, they discovered that there was a billowing smoke behind Mr. Tien's house. The people rushed to Mr. Tien's house to shout and put out the fire. As soon as they opened the workshop door, they witnessed a horrifying scene. Mr. Tien died, sitting curled up in a corner. His body was purple, his eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead, as if he had experienced something terrifying. Fresh blood was flowing from his pupils, giving off a foul stench. Going to the back of the warehouse, they found 3 workers lying there, one of them dead, blood continuously flowing from his mouth, his limbs twisted, his head tilted to one side, his eyes wide open. The other 2 fainted due to lack of oxygen. Luckily, the fire only burned a part of their skin, so their injuries were not too serious. No one knew exactly what happened in the house that caused 2 people to die and 2 others to be injured. Only Mr. Chi, who ran out of the factory, knew clearly. But ever since he returned home, he had been lying in a coma for a whole month, not eating or drinking, only able to drink a bowl of porridge, to the point that his body became emaciated. After a month, his health stabilized and he ate more regularly. Later, Mr. Chi told everyone the whole story, but no one believed him. They just laughed and said a few words. The other 2 kept their mouths shut and did not say a word about the scene at that time, simply saying that it was the rain and lightning that caused the electrical short circuit, leading to Mr. Tien and Mr. Hai dying in that position. These words really had no basis in fact. Anyone who heard them could clearly see that the 2 were trying to hide it, but they could not keep asking. After all, they were the victims in this case. Some people believe in ghosts and spirits, and many others don't, so they are right to do so. That night, in Mr. Fong's house, only his face showed worry and anxiety, especially after knowing that the female ghost was not Mr. Tien's wife, but a ghost he had subdued 10 years ago. She only used his hand to find and kill, then eat human corpses to improve her cultivation. "Old lady, did you achieve your goal after killing him? Then help me out and see." Mr. Fong slapped the machine hard and said angrily. The machine beside him suddenly shook slightly, and a hoarse sound rang out from somewhere in the room. "I haven't finished taking the devil seal yet. If you want to puke, do it yourself." Her voice seemed to have lost a bit of anger, causing the whole house to be filled with cold gloom. Mr. Fong was used to it. Ever since he had come into contact with the spirit, his fear of that thing was gone, but he was still a bit wary, worried that one day soon it would harm him. "Then you quickly go get that demon seal, then come back and help me dispose of its body. If we let it go on for days and months and people find out, we'll be dead." Old Fong anxiously pointed at the warehouse and spoke hastily. Inside was the body of a young man. His whole body was purple. He must have died a long time ago. On his head appeared a sharp slash across the ear and cheek. The skin peeled off to reveal a hideous skull. The blood also clotted and turned dark brown. Perhaps because the body had been dead for too long, it had begun to decompose, swollen like a frog. Maggots were crawling all over the body, moving back and forth on each piece of skin and flesh, each one as big as a chopstick. Flies and mosquitoes were swarming around, making Mr. Fong even more annoyed. I don't know why the stench and bloody smell still didn't get out. Looking at the young man's appearance, he looked 8 or 9 parts like Mr. Fong. Just leave it there. Wait for me to find the demon seal. I will help you dispose of it, the voice rang out again. You go get it tomorrow, then come back and help me quickly, otherwise I won't feel safe leaving it like this. You should remember that thanks to me we have human flesh to eat, Mr. Fong said irritably. 3 parts of his anger was obvious, but only heard her savage laughter in response, then also silence, returning the space to its usual quiet. Since he got the devil seal, Tien has been focusing on staying at home. He has memorized almost the last page of the book that the handsome guy gave him a few years ago. Fortunately, there are still some documents about this thing. He also understands that it can help the soul become immortal for a long time, plus it helps the devil increase his strength by more than half. A normal sorcerer is not afraid of ghosts, but they will be afraid if they have a demon seal, especially if the night demon possesses 2 to 3 at the same time. Its strongest limit is having up to 9 demon seals at a time. Most ordinary sorcerers cannot sense it. Only someone with a very high level of ability can clearly see how many demon seals exist inside it. Although Lao Tien was also one of the most skilled sorcerers, as for why he kept the demon seal, he could somewhat understand it. It was very possible that he wanted to collect more demon seals to create a night demon. Ever since he saw the demon statue placed in the mausoleum behind the summer house, he had felt something strange. The most suspicious point was still the death of his wife. He must have done it to turn his wife into a demon's lackey, but unexpectedly, all his plans failed, and he had to retire from his profession. After the death of old Tien, Tien was a bit startled, but didn't care much because people who do evil will often receive retribution. There are clearly only 5 pages left, but why do I feel like it's not over yet? He picked up the astronomical talisman and looked at it, but he still felt like it wasn't quite complete. Especially the notes on the ghost seal and night ghost were still very vague. Ever since he delved deeper, he felt like he could see through things that were invisible. During this time, every evening at sunset, blood-red clouds appeared. Tien knew that in the near future, an unprecedented disaster would strike Tan Heap Village. The tamarind tree demon had not yet escaped from its cage, but as night fell, the entire tamarind tree began to become eerie and gloomy, and soft cries began to be heard at night, followed by a series of unusual phenomena around the village. There were 2 relatively large cemeteries at both ends, one at the end of the Cotton Mound, and one on the Red Hill, as if blocking the road in and out of this village. Every time people in the village go out at night, they are scared by ghosts. Some people are possessed by ghosts and constantly chase them with knives, causing the whole neighborhood to be filled with fear and anxiety. Today happened to be the 15th day of the lunar calendar. Although the moon was still bright, there were dark clouds covering the sky. Feeling the air become stuffy and heavy, Tien's expression was not very happy, because he knew that the time would come for the female ghost to come find him and reclaim the devil seal in his hands. Everything was ready. If she dared to come, he would punish her. Around the house, Tien buried 70 talismans with red seals engraved on them. Every 5 plates would form a large circle, about 1 to 2 meters wide, with 14 formations in total. They were connected together and placed around Tien's house. No matter which side the demon appeared on, he would fall into the trap. He placed an offering table with 5 fruits, a handful of sticky rice and a bowl of salt on the altar. He placed the devil seal on the table, then performed a spell to remove the seal, helping it to radiate its aura to attract the demon. Everything done, he sat on the porch waiting, the bell also tightly held in his hand. This time he had to catch it to prevent it from harming more innocent people. Waiting until late at night, to the point of having to take a nap to rest, the beautiful image of Fuang suddenly appeared in his mind. Tien was startled awake, hastily chasing her image out of his mind. Every time he did so he felt uneasy, always trying to avoid her, even though he didn't want to. The moon was already hanging overhead. The dark clouds were getting more and more dense, only the moonlight was still there. The air was gradually getting colder, the wind blew in gusts, making rustling sounds. Today the weather was not good, and people were not in a good mood. Tien could only vent all his anger on that demon. If it didn't come, he would make it crawl out and beat it up. In the middle of the night, the moonlight was gradually covered by clouds. Tien sat on the porch and felt the sky darken. His hands were cold because of the strange wind. Before his eyes was a pitch-black space. The treetops in the distance became black spots, constantly swaying back and forth gently. Suddenly he shivered. The coldness ran down his spine, giving him goosebumps. From the distance on the dirt path, a figure was undulating towards them. The figure was not tall but of moderate build, somewhat plump. It was clearly a woman, only she could be seen walking slowly towards them, accompanied by a ghostly sound ringing in the ears, giving the listener goosebumps, a mournful and sorrowful voice. In the cold moonlit night, the wind blows through the forest, the call echoes, calling out to the old soul. The moonlight is dim, someone's figure, gently walking, following the call. Here, there, a call somewhere, the song is mournful, whose soul is now far away. Clouds drift, covering the path, fog covers the path, ho-oi, ho-ai, ho in the middle of the night. Folk songs, humming in the sky, calling someone's soul back in a dream. The forest sways, following someone's song, ho-oi, ho-oh, singing forever and ever. The song just ended. Suddenly her eyes opened wide. In the darkness revealed two bright red lights, like two flickering flames in the air. The sharp eyes cut through the darkness, making Tien shiver. He took a deep breath, knowing that the demon had finally appeared, and quickly stood up to prepare to cast a spell. Around her body, jet-black demonic auras swirled, creating a thick curtain of darkness, in which the stench of blood was so strong that it seemed to cling to every breath. Tien suddenly felt the change in the ground under his feet. It was frighteningly cold, cold like a sharp knife cutting into his flesh. The soles of his feet felt like they were on a giant block of ice, unable to move. The wind began to howl as if it wanted to swallow everything. The bushes on both sides of the road were whipped so hard that their branches and tops broke. The wind seemed to tear the eardrums, making the face burn with pain. He focused his mind, his expression becoming extremely serious. The female ghost had become extremely powerful after killing many people. It was not easy to deal with her. "Where is my demon seal? Give it back to me," she roared ferociously, her face suddenly contorted, her eyes bloodshot, filled with a bottomless hatred. "You mean this?" Tien picked up a small piece of yellow cloth. There were ancient, slanted letters and a circular mark on it, adding to the mysterious feeling. "Give it back to me." The black shadow immediately rushed over like a hungry wolf, charging towards this side. As soon as she entered the range of the formation, Tien immediately chanted a spell, unclear words coming from his mouth. Suddenly, a bright red light erupted around her, and rusty iron stakes began to appear on the ground. On the rusty iron stakes there were still many dark blood stains. Each one had very old-looking chains. Her face became even more ferocious, continuously using her two bloody hands to scratch around the iron stake, creating sharp clanging sounds, the sound numbing the scalp. The demonic aura from her body was released, dyeing the area pitch black, along with a piercing scream. "You sorcerers! I curse you! I curse you to die a horrible death!" The 5 iron stakes suddenly shook slightly, as if they were about to lose the ability to withstand the expanding demonic energy within them. Tien's expression turned ugly for a moment. This was the first time he had fought the legendary night demon. Although she had lost her seal, her strength was still not to be underestimated. If she had obtained the demon's seal and completed her night demon incarnation, he definitely would not be able to defeat her. Feeling each iron stake swaying back and forth, Tien quickly took the bone broom in his hand, which was already covered with a powerful red talisman, and whipped it hard into the air. A silvery light emitted from it, like magic, striking hard into the iron cage. "Hey!" Suddenly, she screamed in pain, her ferocious face showing fear. Countless yin chi transformed into tentacles as if wanting to pierce through the cage and escape. Seeing this, he whipped it even harder. The more he hit, the more he noticed that the demonic energy was gradually becoming thinner and weaker. She screamed even more miserably, her figure and the demonic energy gathered into a mass, nestling in the middle of the formation. "Please, forgive me, teacher. I don't want to." Not knowing how much time had passed, she suddenly began to beg for her life, writhing and screaming miserably. Only then did Tien stop, his spirit still on high alert, not letting down his guard. "Finally convinced?" Tien's cold voice rang out, his eyes focused on the old woman's figure. I am convinced. Please spare my life." I promise I will never dare to bother you again. She continued to speak, her voice still cold and hoarse. Heaven would naturally not let her go, especially those demons who had evolved into night ghosts. Its words were even more unbelievable. One was to lock her in a jar and stick a talisman on it to seal her. Two was to beat her until her soul was scattered, or to tame the demonic energy on her body and turn her back into a normal ghost. Just as he was about to ask her if she would be willing to cut off her demonic energy and become a normal spirit, then find a chance to reincarnate. Suddenly, he felt dizzy, and a strong smell of blood suddenly poured out from the iron cage. Streams of crimson blood flowed out like a stream, reaching his feet. Tien was startled and panicked. Looking back, he discovered that she had stood up at some point. Her pale face and fierce eyes were staring at him, and she had a lifeless, mocking smile. The originally pitch-black sky suddenly turned a gloomy blood color. Fog fell down without him noticing, making him shiver down his spine. What happened? He was extremely frightened, his breathing felt a little rushed, his shoulders suddenly felt unusually heavy, almost making him sit on the ground. The air was getting heavier and heavier, a foul stench kept swirling around him. The pressure was so heavy that he had to breathe through his mouth. The broom in his hand exploded into a small cloud of dust. Ha ha ha! You're so immature. The night demon is not something that low-level people like you can fight against. She revealed a grim smile, feeling extremely excited. Without the broom in his hand, but still with the ancient bell, he wanted to pick it up and ring it, but suddenly realized in despair that he couldn't even lift his hand, let alone ring the bell. Bang! A low voice rang out. He looked back in panic. The magical cage was broken by the female ghost. He could only watch as she walked out. The demonic energy on her body became even thicker. She overturned all the tools on the altar table and pressed her hideous, maggot-infested face closer. He could clearly feel her breath on his face. The burning, painful sensation made him shiver in fear. Only saw the female ghost pick up the bundle of cloth containing the demon's seal. The sound like the underworld forest rang out coldly. You are so immature. Obediently give me your soul and flesh. I will slowly eat until there is nothing left. After saying that, she smiled from ear to ear. Only now did he realize that he had been careless, and that his magic power was still very weak. He realized that he had underestimated what used to be a night demon. Even a female ghost without a seal was this strong, so how powerful would a real night demon be? Even how terrifying would a 9-seal night demon be? He didn't even dare to think about this. He couldn't imagine the scene at that time. The more Tien thought, the more scared he became. The female ghost extended her bloody hand with sharp claws, slowly stabbing deep into his chest. He could clearly feel his flesh being pierced by that cold hand. The coldness penetrated his soul. The prolonged pain made his pale face wrinkled and looked very unsightly. That pain made him desperate. His body was imprisoned in a ghostly space. He watched helplessly as she thrust her hand into his chest, as if wanting to dig his heart out. Suddenly, her hand stopped in her body, her eyes shining brightly as she looked up at the sky. Tien looked into her eyes with suspicion, but found that in her red pupils there was panic and fear. Is it the night demon? She said in fear, hastily retreating to escape. The river of blood also disappeared immediately after. He was stunned as he watched the female ghost run away with a panicked expression, thousands of questions appearing in his mind. Even ghosts were afraid. What was it that made her so afraid? The sky suddenly attracted a thick, evil aura, so thick that it covered a large area of the sky. Thunder rumbled, and the wind blew stronger than ever. Tien looked up at the sky in surprise, a feeling of unease rising in his heart. Boom! The female ghost was frantically running away, when suddenly a bolt of lightning struck her, causing her to scream in pain. Her limp figure lay on the ground, as bolts of lightning struck her. Heaven could smell a burning smell, a smell like roast beef. Suddenly in the sky a red figure appeared. It was a girl, wearing a long red dress, her long hair hanging down, covering her entire face. Only her white eyes without pupils could be vaguely seen. The girl was suspended in midair, her entire body straight like a lifeless tree. Silently watching the female ghost being mercilessly struck by lightning, struck to the point that her soul almost flew away. Miss, please forgive me. I didn't know this was your territory. Please forgive me. Please, she kept begging and pleading, but the girl still didn't respond, coldly looking at her without any emotion. In no time, the girl appeared beside the female ghost, snatched the bundle of yellow cloth from her hand, then opened her wide mouth and swallowed it. This scene made Tien shiver and scared, because the cloth had a spell in it, yet the female ghost in the red dress still swallowed it, indifferently acting as if nothing had happened. What was even more terrifying was that the girl just casually waved her hand, causing the old woman's soul to fly away in an instant. The witness suddenly shuddered in fear, retreating dozens of steps in fear, her eyes wide open, sweat dripping from her forehead, even soaking her entire body. After finishing, the girl glanced at him, said nothing, and disappeared into the night, returning the space to its original silence. After going through all this, Tien quickly let out a breath. The fear was still there, and his body was still shaking, haunting him forever. Especially the strength of the girl in red, making him unable to fight back. After the disappearance of the old ghost, Mr. Fong's house suddenly emitted a strong stench of long-dead corpses. The incense sticks made from human corpses no longer gave off a strong fragrance. Instead, they smelled of burnt grilled meat. Many people were suspicious, so they called the police again, and this time Mr. Chien's family was also involved. The results confirmed that Mr. Fong's incense factory was made from dead human flesh. Including Ms. An and Mr. Fong's wife, many people who heard the news turned pale and stopped eating meat for almost a year because of psychological trauma. In addition, the police searched Mr. Fong's house and discovered a badly decomposed body. This body was the man's son. Mr. Fong was later sentenced to death by the court for the crimes he had committed, ending a bloody and gruesome story. Even decades later, no one could forget the haunting scene of that year. Tien, after escaping death from the old demon, witnessed the fight between the demon and the night demon. He realized that he was still very weak and needed to learn many new things to help the villagers resolve the disaster of the past 100 years. He also confirmed that the girl in red was the demon that the shaman had sealed away years ago. The appearance of the girl made him feel extremely uneasy, forcing him to set out to find more clues about the mysteries of the past, the mystery of the sorcerer, the girl in red, and the book Astronomy and Talisman.